Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. The Renaissance is often remembered as a season of beauty, but its story was never only about beauty. It was a story of bankers who purchased immortality in paint and stone, popes who turned ruins into monuments of authority, scholars who searched forgotten libraries for the voices of Rome, and artists who learned to make marble seem like breath, skin, grief, and thought. Behind the famous names stood workshops, contracts, rival cities, fragile republics, ambitious courts, and wars that moved across Italy, while painters, architects, printers, and philosophers tried to give order to a changing world. If Quiet Chronicles has become part of your week, a gentle like and subscription helps keep these long histories coming. New stories are published weekly, each one made to give the past enough room to unfold at its own pace. This is the story of the Renaissance as it slowly formed across Europe. Not a sudden awakening, but a long change in how people looked at the past, the body, the city, the page, the heavens, and themselves. And it begins in the crowded, quarrelsome, wealthy cities of late medieval Italy. Chapter 1. The Late Medieval Soil. Northern and central Italy did not wait for the word Renaissance before it began to change. In the 13th and 14th centuries, its cities were already crowded with merchants, notaries, judges, bankers, friars, guild officers, cathedral builders, and families whose names could rise or fall with a vote, a loan, a marriage, or a street quarrel. Florence, Siena, Venice, Milan, Bologna, Pisa, and Genoa did not resemble quiet museum settings, and they were not yet the polished places later travelers imagined. They were working cities, competitive and devotional, restless in their politics, careful with records, proud of their churches, and unusually aware that public life needed visible forms. A chapel, a town hall, a bridge, a painted wall, a set of bronze doors, a family palace. Even a funeral procession could become part of the language of status. This was still a medieval world. Bells marked prayer, saints filled calendars, relics drew reverence, and the church stood at the center of imagination as well as authority. Yet Italian urban life gave laymen more space to act than many other parts of Europe, because merchants and guildsmen did not merely sell cloth or lend money. They sat in councils, paid taxes, funded buildings, and defended their neighborhoods with a seriousness that made civic identity feel almost personal. Florence, especially, bound politics to work through its guild system, so that participation in public life depended upon membership in one of the recognized corporate bodies. A man's craft or commercial association was not a small private detail. It helped determine whether he could belong to the governing life of the city. In that arrangement lay one of the Renaissance's quiet beginnings. It did not begin as a clean rejection of the Middle Ages, and it did not begin as a sudden discovery that human beings mattered. Medieval Europe had never forgotten human grief, ambition, beauty, pride, or learning. The change was subtler than that. In some Italian cities, worldly activity acquired a new dignity, and the memory of antiquity slowly became useful to people who were building careers, defending reputations, educating sons, decorating chapels, and imagining their cities as heirs to older forms of greatness. Florence's wealth came first from cloth, especially wool, and from the patient, complicated labor that turned raw material into exportable goods. The city's merchants depended on dyers, carders, fullers, finishers, packers, brokers, carriers, and clerks, each one part of a chain that linked Tuscan streets to markets far beyond the Arno. Account books mattered because credit mattered, and credit depended on memory made exact. Names, sums, dates, obligations, and repayments passed into ledgers, where human trust became columns of ink. A culture trained to keep records was also a culture increasingly able to preserve letters, contracts, wills, chronicles, and the small written traces from which reputation could be built. Banking grew naturally from this commercial world. Italian merchants had to move money across regions where coinage, law, and political risk were never simple, and banking families learned to make themselves necessary to princes, bishops, popes, and cities. Before the Medici became the most famous example, other families had already shown how financial service could lead into political influence and cultural display. Money did not replace birth, faith, or office, but it entered into each of them. A banker who financed a chapel or lent to the papacy could appear as a servant of God, a citizen of consequence, and a man securing the memory of his household in stone and paint. The Italian communes were never peaceful republics in any sentimental sense. Their liberty often came with faction, vendetta, exile, and the strain of governing ambitious men who feared one another. The language of public good existed beside the practice of private rivalry, and civic offices changed hands in systems designed to prevent any single family from holding power too openly for too long. In Florence, the conflict between Guelph and Ghibelline, and later between rival Guelph factions, left marks on families, streets, and careers. Politics could reach into a household with the force of weather, turning a citizen into an exile and a neighbor into an enemy. Dante Alighieri belonged to that world before he became one of its great witnesses. Born in Florence in 1265, he lived as a citizen, soldier, poet, office holder, and factional man, not as a distant literary monument. His education carried the marks of medieval theology and philosophy, but his imagination remained filled with the actual city around him, its bridges, baptistry, towers, noble houses, moneylenders, angry factions, and sharp memories of insult. In 1302, after the Black Guelphs took control of Florence with help from Charles of Valois, Dante was condemned while away from the city. The sentence fined him, excluded him from office, and threatened death by burning if he returned without submitting to the terms laid upon him. Exile gave Dante's poetry a wound that never fully closed. The Divine Comedy contains the vast architecture of Christian eternity, but it also carries the heat of Florentine politics, the names of enemies, the fate of friends, the bitterness of corruption, and the longing of a man separated from his city. Even Paradise does not erase the memory of civic life. The poem's greatness rests partly in that union of the eternal and the local, because Dante made theology speak through particular streets, families, offices, and historical choices. Later Renaissance writers inherited many things from him, including the possibility that a modern Italian life could stand beside ancient and sacred history without disappearing beneath them. Painting, too, had begun to shift before the 15th century announced itself. Cimabue, working in the older Italo-Byzantine tradition, gave sacred figures grandeur and solemn force, while Giotto di Bondone carried those figures into a heavier, more human world. Giotto's frescoes in the Arena Chapel at Padua, painted in the early 14th century, did not abandon devotion. They made devotion visible through bodies that leaned, mourned, embraced, recoiled, and occupied space with an unfamiliar gravity. In scenes of lamentation, recognition, betrayal, and mercy. Gesture became a form of thought. The change was not theatrical in the modern sense, but it gave sacred history a human nearness that later painters studied with care. Giotto's reputation spread because his work seemed to solve a problem that many artists after him continue to refine. How could a flat wall hold a convincing world? How could holy figures remain holy while also appearing to stand, bend, grieve, or turn toward one another as living bodies did? The answers were technical, but they were also cultural. A society that cared about civic presence, public ceremony, and individual reputation was ready to notice when painted figures seemed to possess weight and personality. The wall became a place where theology, memory, and social observation met. Petrarch was born in 1304, only 2 years after Dante's exile, and his life opened another path into what later generations called Renaissance humanism. His father had also been exiled from Florence, which meant that Petrarch grew up with displacement as part of family memory. He studied law because his father wished it, but his deepest attachment settled on language, poetry, manuscripts, and the recovered voices of ancient Rome. Latin was not merely a learned instrument for him. It was a medium through which the dead could be approached as minds, not just authorities. Manuscript culture made that approach slow and physical. Books had to be copied by hand, preserved in monasteries, cathedral libraries, private collections, and chancery offices, and discovered through travel, friendship, inquiry, and luck. Marginal notes carried traces of earlier readers, while errors in copying could alter a sentence and pass unnoticed for years. Petrarch's hunger for ancient texts belonged to this world of scarcity, where finding a manuscript could feel like recovering part of a broken conversation. His later discovery of Cicero's letters in Verona in 1345 mattered because the letters revealed not only a Roman statesman, but a human being with anxieties, friendships, vanity, disappointment, and private urgency. Boccaccio, born in 1313, extended the literary world that Dante and Petrarch had opened. His life connected Florence, Naples, mercantile culture, courtly society, classical learning, and the vernacular imagination. He admired Dante, befriended Petrarch, gathered stories, studied antiquity, and wrote in a prose that could carry merchants, women, clerics, servants, lovers, fools, and clever survivors into literature with remarkable ease. The Decameron, shaped by the memory of plague, framed storytelling as a human response to social collapse. It did not turn suffering into spectacle. It allowed speech, wit, memory, and order to continue after ordinary life had been shaken. The shaking came with the Black Death, which reached the Mediterranean in the late 1340s and moved through Italian cities with terrible speed. Genoese and Venetian trading connections, so often sources of wealth, also made the peninsula vulnerable to disease moving along maritime routes. City governments tried to respond through ordinances, burial measures, restrictions, and emergency forms of administration, though the scale of death overwhelmed normal civic habits. Houses lost members, workshops lost masters and apprentices, monasteries lost brothers, and public offices had to function in the presence of fear. The plague did not create the Renaissance, but it changed the world in which Renaissance habits grew. After the epidemic, labor, inheritance, devotion, and memory all carried new pressures. Some families gained property because others had vanished. Some workers found their bargaining position altered because hands were fewer. Some religious communities absorbed gifts from people who wanted prayers said for the dead. The experience also sharpened the value of record, testimony, and remembrance. Chronicles, wills, sermons, poems, and stories became ways of giving form to disruption. A city that had watched its routines falter could still rebuild, but rebuilding carried a different knowledge of fragility. Italian life in the later 14th century therefore held several forces together. There was commercial discipline, with its contracts and ledgers. There was civic rivalry, with its offices, factions, and exiles. There was religious devotion, still central and sincere, shaping art, charity, time, and death. There was a growing respect for ancient language and example, not as a decorative taste, but as a resource for thinking about virtue, fame, government, friendship, and loss. None of these forces alone made the Renaissance. Their meeting made the soil from which it slowly rose. The next movement of the story belongs to Petrarch more fully, to his books, his letters, his search for antiquity, and his belief that the ancient dead had not vanished completely. If their words could still be found, copied, answered, and loved. Chapter 2: Petrarch and the Recovery of Ancient Voices. Francesco Petrarca entered the Renaissance before the Renaissance had a name, and part of his importance lies in that uncertainty. He did not stand at the head of a movement with banners and followers arranged neatly behind him. He lived instead as a scholar, poet, traveler, correspondent, and restless collector of words, moving through a 14th century world still shaped by papal courts, noble patrons, university habits, monastic libraries, and the slow labor of manuscript copying. Yet in the middle of that world, Petrarch gave ancient literature a new emotional force. He did not treat Roman writers only as authorities to be mined for useful quotations. He treated them as voices that could still answer loneliness, ambition, public failure, private longing, and the ache of time. Born in Arezzo in 1304, Petrarch inherited exile almost before memory. His father, Ser Petrarco, had been driven from Florence in the same political convulsion that had taken Dante from the city, and the family's movement eventually carried the young Petrarch toward Avignon, where the papal court had settled under French influence. Avignon was not Rome, and for Petrarch that mattered deeply. It was crowded with clerics, lawyers, petitioners, diplomats, scribes, money, favors, and administrative business, a place where the Church's universal claims passed through offices and documents. For a young man with literary hunger, it offered contacts and patrons, but it also sharpened his feeling that something had been displaced. Rome, in his imagination, remained the broken center of an older dignity. His father wanted him to study law, and Petrarch obeyed long enough to know that law would not hold him. He studied at Montpellier and Bologna, where the habits of the medieval university still trained men in authoritative texts, glosses, disputation, and professional advancement. The discipline was useful, even when the profession failed to attract him. Legal study taught careful reading, the weighing of words, and respect for textual authority, but Petrarch's deepest loyalty moved elsewhere, toward poetry, moral reflection, and the recovered Latin of ancient writers. Cicero, Virgil, Livy, Seneca, and Augustine became for him more than names in a curriculum. They became companions in a life spent trying to reconcile Christian conscience, worldly fame, literary ambition, and inward unease. A notable part of Petrarch's originality was not that he admired antiquity, because medieval scholars had admired antiquity before him. The difference lay in temperature. He approached ancient authors with a personal tenderness that made them feel near, and he wrote letters to Cicero, Livy, Homer, and others, as though time had thinned but not destroyed the possibility of address. This habit could seem strange to a modern reader, and yet it reveals much about early humanism. Antiquity was not a museum behind glass. It was a set of unfinished relationships, damaged by neglect, waiting for readers patient enough to restore them. The public sign of this devotion came in 1341, when Petrarch received the laurel crown as poet laureate on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. The ceremony mattered partly because it was theatrical in the old civic sense, placing a living Christian poet under an honor associated with classical memory. Rome at that time was not the imperial city of marble command that Renaissance imagination loved to summon. It was uneven, damaged, inhabited among ruins, governed through tangled forces, and often humbler than the idea of Rome carried in books. That contrast gave the coronation its force. Petrarch stood in a real city of broken remains while accepting a symbol from a literary city that had never ceased to trouble European memory. The laurel crown did not make him ancient, and it did not make Rome whole. It did something smaller and more durable. It announced that poetry, learning, and fame could be joined again to civic honor, and that a modern writer might ask to be measured against the old world without claiming to equal it. Petrarch's desire for fame was never hidden, but it was complicated by Christian self-examination. He wanted glory and distrusted the desire for it. He wished to be remembered and knew that earthly memory was unstable. This tension gave his writing a living pulse, because he made ambition itself into a subject of moral thought. His Latin epic, Africa, centered on Scipio Africanus, shows how strongly Roman greatness worked upon him. Yet the poem that later readers often loved most was not the work of public heroism, but the scattered lyric sequence associated with Laura, the woman he said he first saw in the church of Saint Clair in Avignon in 1327. Whether Laura de Noves can be securely identified in every biographical detail matters less than the literary fact of her presence. She became the figure through whom Petrarch refined longing into an art of distance, memory, self-reproach, and verbal music. The poems did not invent love poetry, but they gave later European lyric an interior drama that endured for centuries. In 1345, at Verona, Petrarch found a manuscript of Cicero's letters to Atticus, Quintus, and Brutus. The discovery changed his sense of Cicero, and through Cicero it changed the humanist relation to antiquity. The orator who had often appeared as a master of style and public eloquence now appeared as a man entangled in fear, friendship, vanity, calculation, affection, and disappointment. Cicero became less like a monument and more like a mind moving under pressure. For Petrarch, this was precious. Ancient literature did not merely preserve perfected speech. It preserved the unstable humanity of those who had lived before. Manuscript hunting required patience, travel, conversation, and a willingness to ask after neglected volumes in places where dust and disorder might conceal a treasure. Monastic and cathedral libraries did not always know the future value of what they held. A codex might sit with damaged leaves, uncertain attribution, or errors introduced by generations of copying. Petrarch copied, corrected, annotated, borrowed, and searched through networks of friendship and patronage. His humanism therefore depended on material acts, finding parchment, reading difficult hands, comparing versions, sending copies, and trusting that a text could cross distance without losing itself entirely. Boccaccio became one of the most important companions in this labor. Their friendship joined two different temperaments, Petrarch more drawn to Latin moral seriousness, and Boccaccio more openly alive to the vernacular world of stories, social variety, and human comedy. Yet both men loved Dante, both cared about antiquity, and both understood that literature could preserve a world otherwise exposed to political violence and death. Boccaccio visited Petrarch, exchanged books and letters with him, and absorbed from him a deeper reverence for classical study. In return, Boccaccio's own work showed how modern life, in all its mixture of wit, appetite, grief, and cleverness, could enter serious literature without apology. The Decameron, written after the Black Death, belongs to the aftermath of the plague that had altered Europe so severely. Its frame is famous. Young Florentines withdraw from the afflicted city and tell stories to order time, conversation, and memory. The importance of the book is not only that it contains 100 tales, it is that Boccaccio gave social speech a large and graceful architecture. Merchants, wives, friars, tricksters, nobles, servants, lovers, and fools move through its pages with a confidence that reveals a widening literary attention. The human world did not have to be ideal in order to be worthy of narration. Petrarch's humanism, however, was never only literary. It also carried a political imagination shaped by Rome. The strangest and most revealing example was Cola di Rienzo, the Roman notary who attempted in 1347 to revive the city's republican dignity through a dramatic tribunate. Cola used inscriptions, ceremonies, ancient titles, and civic language to present himself as the restorer of Roman liberty. Petrarch admired him at first, because Cola seemed to give political body to the dream of Rome's renewal. The ruins were no longer mute stones. They became evidence in an argument about what Rome might be again. Cola's movement did not last. His rule became unstable, theatrical, and increasingly detached from the difficult realities of Roman faction, noble power, papal absence, and military weakness. Petrarch's disappointment revealed a lesson that would return throughout the Renaissance. Antiquity could inspire reform, but it could also mislead those who mistook ancient language for present power. Roman names did not restore Roman conditions. A tribune in the 14th century stood among baronial families, papal politics, urban poverty, and foreign interests that no ceremony could remove. This tension between book and world became one of the living features of Renaissance humanism. Scholars recovered ancient texts, but they did not enter antiquity as it had been. They carried those texts into Christian courts, Italian communes, papal offices, princely households, schools, and private studies. A sentence from Cicero could shape a letter of advice. Livy could sharpen thought about republics. Seneca could speak to inward discipline. Augustine could stand between classical eloquence and Christian self-scrutiny. The past returned not as a complete system, but as a set of voices that changed the present by being heard again. Avignon remained important in this story because it gave Petrarch both opportunity and irritation. The papal court there connected him to patrons and ecclesiastical income, yet he criticized its corruption and distance from Rome. His complaints were moral, literary, and symbolic at once. Rome represented not merely a city, but a measure against which the present seemed diminished. Still, the very world he criticized helped sustain him. Like many Renaissance figures after him, Petrarch depended on the institutions he judged, and this dependence gave his life some of its human complexity. The habit of writing letters became central to that life. Petrarch arranged, revised, and preserved his correspondence with a care that shows how strongly he wished to shape his own memory. Letters moved between friends, patrons, scholars, and powerful men. carrying news, advice, praise, rebuke, consolation, and displays of style. A letter could be private in tone and public in ambition. It could build a circle of readers who recognized one another through shared reverence for ancient language and moral reflection. Before print made books multiply with mechanical speed, correspondence helped humanism spread through chosen relationships. There is something quietly decisive in this. The Renaissance did not begin only in paintings, domes, statues, or palaces. It also began in the small, disciplined acts of reading and answering. A scholar found a manuscript, copied a phrase, corrected a word, sent a letter, praised an ancient author, rebuked a living patron, and slowly formed a community around the belief that language could recover dignity from time. The movement was fragile because manuscripts were fragile, and strong because desire made people search for them. Petrarch died in 1374 at Arquois, among books and papers that already suggested the shape of a life consciously arranged for remembrance. Boccaccio followed in 1375, leaving behind not only the Decameron, but also lectures, biographies, classical studies, and his devotion to Dante's memory. Their century had known exile, plague, papal displacement, civic violence, and uncertainty. Yet out of it came a new reverence for the written trace of human experience. Florence, meanwhile, continued to gather wealth, skill, rivalry, and ambition. The voices Petrarch had recovered would soon meet bronze, brick, banking, and political calculation in a city ready to turn learning, money, and art into public form. Chapter 3: Florence, Bronze, Brick, and the Medici. Bronze, wool, stone, and money gave 15th century Florence much of its form before later memory gave it the softer name of culture. The city's churches and palaces did not rise from beauty alone, and its artists did not work in a world separate from contracts, guilds, rival families, taxes, and public expectation. Florence was a republic in language and habit, but it was also a city of dense private influence, where families measured one another through marriage alliances, commercial credit, chapel patronage, political office, and the visible dignity of their houses. The Arno ran through a place that made cloth for distant markets, argued over government in council chambers, and turned religious commissions into civic statements. Its renaissance came from that mixture: devotion, competition, calculation, memory, and the wish to leave something durable behind. The wool trade remained one of Florence's great foundations. Raw wool passed through many hands before it became the finished cloth that enriched merchants and sustained workshops. The Arte della Lana, the wool guild, did not merely supervise a trade. It represented one of the organized powers of the city, with money, statutes, buildings, and public responsibilities. Other guilds, including those of bankers, judges, physicians, silk merchants, and craftsmen, helped structure civic life. A man's professional body gave him standing, and standing gave him access to the Republic's offices. In such a city, art was never only private adornment. A painting, a statue, or a building could express piety, but it could also mark one's place in the civic order. Banking carried Florence beyond Tuscany. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, born in 1360, built the family bank into an institution of uncommon reach, and his service to the papacy gave the Medici a source of profit and prestige that mattered greatly. Papal finance was not a decorative branch of banking. It meant handling revenues, transfers, obligations, and relationships at the highest level of the Latin Church. Giovanni did not yet rule Florence, and the Medici were not princes. But the family learned how influence could be gathered without always being loudly declared. Wealth, placed carefully, could become friendship, obligation, gratitude, and eventually power. Cosimo de' Medici inherited more than money from his father. He inherited a method. Cosimo understood that in Florence, open domination could provoke resistance, while generosity, lending, patronage, marriage, and quiet political management could work more smoothly. He gave to churches and convents, supported scholars, collected books, and helped fund buildings. Yet these acts did not belong only to devotion or taste. They created memory and dependence. Florence remained a republic, with councils, offices, elections, and old civic language. But beneath that surface, networks of loyalty could decide who prospered and who failed. The first great artistic moment of this chapter came before Cosimo's full ascendancy, in 1401, when Florence held a competition for a new set of bronze doors for the baptistry of San Giovanni. The baptistry mattered because it belonged to the city's sacred and civic identity. Generations of Florentines had entered Christian life through that octagonal building. The competitors were asked to make a bronze panel showing the sacrifice of Isaac, and among those who entered were Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi. Later memory loved the contest because it seemed to place two futures side by side: Ghiberti's graceful mastery in bronze and Brunelleschi's sharper, more compressed drama. Ghiberti won the commission, and the victory shaped his life for decades. Bronze work demanded patience, calculation, and expense, because metal had to be modeled, cast, chased, finished, and fitted with great skill. The doors became a public object touched by religion, guild pride, technical ambition, and civic display. Brunelleschi's loss did not remove him from the story. It may have turned him more decisively toward architecture, measurement, and the ancient remains he studied in Rome. Florence did not lose one genius and keep another. It set two forms of intelligence moving along different paths. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore had stood for many years with an enormous problem above it. Its crossing required a dome of a size that challenged the available methods of construction, and the city's ambition had outpaced the obvious engineering solution. Brunelleschi eventually answered that challenge with a design that used a double shell, careful ribbing, herringbone brickwork, and machines devised to lift materials high above the ground. The dome rose without the traditional full wooden centering that such a vast structure might have seemed to require, and this made the work not only beautiful but intellectually astonishing. Florence could look upward and see, in brick and stone, a solution to a problem it had inherited from its own pride. The dome mattered because it joined technical invention to civic identity. It was not a solitary artist's gesture made in silence. It involved masons, carpenters, brickmakers, rope, pulleys, hoists, administrators, payments, inspections, and years of practical adjustment. Brunelleschi's mind was central, but the dome also belonged to a city capable of funding, debating, and sustaining such work. This is one of the gentler corrections the Renaissance always asks of memory. The famous name remains important, but the achievement stands on many kinds of labor that fame rarely preserves with equal care. Brunelleschi's interest in proportion and measurement also touched the development of linear perspective. Renaissance perspective was not merely a trick for making depth appear on a flat surface. It trained the eye to imagine the visible world as measurable, ordered, and capable of being reconstructed through geometry. The story of Brunelleschi demonstrating perspective with a painted view of the Florentine baptistry became part of the city's artistic memory. Whether every detail of the demonstration can be recovered with certainty or not. What mattered was the larger shift. Space itself could be studied, disciplined, and made to obey a rational system. Donatello gave sculpture a related human force. His early work for public niches and churches showed the continuing importance of civic and religious commission. But his bronze David, probably made for the Medici palace, carried a different kind of presence. It was small enough for a domestic or palace setting rather than a great public facade. Yet it held the charged memory of the biblical hero in a body shaped with unusual grace and ambiguity. The statue's placement within Medici space mattered. Sacred and civic symbolism could move into the household of a powerful family, where art served devotion, learning, prestige, and private display at once. Masaccio, who died young in 1428, changed painting with a severity that later artists could not ignore. In the Brancacci Chapel in Florence, his frescoes gave biblical scenes a firm spatial world, with bodies that seemed to carry weight and shadows that belonged to a common light. The tribute money, especially, arranged sacred narrative with a clarity that made figures appear present within a measured environment. Masaccio did not abandon holiness by giving bodies mass. He allowed sacred history to inhabit the same convincing space that viewers themselves occupied. That achievement made painting feel newly responsible to sight. Florence in these years was also a city of rivalry, and the Medici rise did not pass without resistance. Palestrozzi and other wealthy citizens represented a world in which no single family wished to be overshadowed by another. In 1433, Cosimo de' Medici was arrested and exiled, a sign that his influence had become too large to ignore. Exile, in Florence, was both punishment and political instrument, familiar from Dante's Fate and many others. Cosimo's removal might have ended the family's ascent if his networks had been weaker, or if his enemies had been more united. Instead, Cosimo returned in 1434. The event did not crown him king, and Florence did not announce itself as a Medici principality. The Republic's forms remained, which was precisely what made the settlement durable for a time. Cosimo's supporters regained influence. His enemies were displaced or weakened, and the city learned to live with a power that preferred to operate through existing institutions rather than abolish them. The Medici strength lay partly in this restraint. Rule could be most effective when it did not always look like rule. Under Cosimo, patronage deepened into a civic and spiritual language. He supported the rebuilding of San Marco, where the Dominican convent became associated with learning, reform, and the frescoes of Fra Angelico. He backed architectural work by Michelangelo, collected manuscripts, and encouraged the study of Greek and Latin texts. His household and circle gave humanists a place to gather, translate, dedicate, and discuss. The recovery of antiquity that Petrarch had loved now found stronger institutional shelter in Florence, because money could buy books, support scholars, and make learning visible in libraries and buildings. The Council of Florence in 1439 added another layer to the city's intellectual life, called as part of an effort to heal the division between the Latin and Greek churches. It brought Eastern churchmen, scholars, and texts into closer contact with Italian humanists. The religious union it proclaimed did not endure in the way its supporters hoped, but the presence of Greek learning mattered. Figures such as Gemistus Plitho stimulated interest in Plato and ancient philosophy, while Florence scholars and patrons absorbed the prestige of Greek manuscripts with renewed hunger. Here again, a failed or fragile political religious project left cultural consequences behind. Cosimo's Florence therefore joined several currents that had been gathering since the previous century. The city had merchant wealth, political tension, guild discipline, devotional need, architectural daring, revived classical study, and artists trained to make space, body, and gesture more convincing. None of this removed the older world. Churches still dominated the skyline, saints still filled commissions, and salvation still mattered more than fame in the official language of Christian society. Yet fame had become harder to deny. Families wished to be remembered, artists began to be named with greater force, and cities imagined their own achievements as worthy of history. The story now moves from public monuments and powerful patrons into the places where much of this change was actually learned. The workshop, the guild, the contract, the wall prepared for fresco, the panel waiting for pigment, and the trained eye that slowly taught European art how to measure the visible world. Chapter 4: The Workshop and the Trained Eye. The Renaissance workshop was not a separate chamber of inspiration, sealed away from ordinary labor. It belonged to the city's working life, close to guild statutes, contracts, apprenticeships, merchants, patrons, deadlines, and the slow preparation of materials. A painter's shop might contain boys grinding pigments, assistants transferring designs, panels being sized and smoothed, cartoons pricked for dusting, and small devotional images waiting beside larger civic or ecclesiastical commissions. The master's name carried the reputation, but the work itself often passed through many hands before it reached an altar, a chapel wall, a palace room, or the public space for which it had been ordered. In this world, art was learned through repetition before it was transformed by invention. Apprentices entered young, often bound by agreement to serve a master for years. They swept floors, prepared glue, ground minerals and earths into usable color, learned to handle brushes, copied patterns, and slowly absorbed the discipline of drawing. The labor could seem humble, but it trained the hand to obey the eye, and the eye to notice proportion, contour, shadow, drapery, and expression. Pigments themselves carried histories of trade and cost. Ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli brought from far beyond Italy, could be more expensive than gold, while earth colors, lead white, vermilion, azurite, and malachite, each required knowledge of preparation and use. A contract might specify where costly blue should appear, because material value was part of the painting's meaning. Guilds stood behind this discipline. In Florence, painters were associated with the Arte dei Medici e Speziali, the guild of doctors and apothecaries, because pigments and prepared substances belonged partly to the world of specialized materials. This connection is easy to miss, but it reveals how Renaissance art grew from the practical classifications of the city. The painter was not yet the fully independent genius of later imagination. He was a trained maker whose materials, reputation, and commercial trust had to be regulated. Originality came through a world that first taught obedience to craft. Leon Battista Alberti gave that craft a new theoretical dignity. Born in 1404 into a Florentine family in exile, he became one of the clearest examples of the learned Renaissance man, writer, architect, theorist, churchman, mathematician, and observer of social life. His treatise De Pictura, written in Latin in 1435 and then in Italian, offered painting a language drawn from geometry, optics, rhetoric, and moral purpose. Alberti did not invent linear perspective alone. and he knew he was writing within a larger world of experiment and practice. Yet he gave painters a way to understand their work as an intellectual art, not merely a manual one. The heart of Alberti's teaching was the idea that the painted surface could be treated as an open window through which the viewer looked into a constructed space. This idea made vision orderly. Objects could be placed according to proportion. Figures could stand in relation to one another, and the visible world could be arranged through mathematical recession. The effect was not only technical, it changed the dignity of painting by suggesting that the artist understood the rational structure of sight. To paint well was to think clearly about space, bodies, and the viewer's position before the image. Paolo Uccello carried perspective with an almost obsessive delight. His paintings and drawings suggest a mind fascinated by foreshortening, broken lances, tiled floors, armor, horses, and the puzzle of placing forms inside a measurable field. Later stories about him may exaggerate his absorption, but they preserve a real truth about the period. Perspective could become a passion because it promised mastery over appearance. A battlefield, a saint's miracle, a domestic room, or a sacred gathering could be arranged as if the world had hidden rules, and the painter had found one of them. Fresco demanded another kind of discipline. A wall painting had to be planned carefully because wet plaster accepted pigment only while it remained workable. The painter and assistants prepared a section for the day, the giornata, and the size of that section depended on how much could be painted before the plaster dried. This made fresco a collaboration between design and time. A large chapel wall was not completed through one continuous act, but through a sequence of daily surfaces, each one joined to the next with enough skill that the viewer would not feel the laboring divisions beneath the image. Fra Angelico worked within that discipline in a way that joined craft, devotion, and Dominican life. At San Marco in Florence, under Medici patronage and within a reformed convent, his frescoes gave religious images to cells, corridors, and communal spaces. The Annunciations, crucifixions, saints, and scenes of Christ were not simply decorations. They belonged to a rhythm of prayer, study, silence, and communal identity. Their colors and forms remained gentle, but their gentleness should not be mistaken for weakness. Fra Angelico's restraint gave the images a devotional clarity suited to the lives around them. In the Brancacci Chapel, Masaccio had already shown how fresco could carry human gravity into sacred narrative. Later artists came to study those walls because the figures seemed to stand under a shared light and inhabit a space that made moral action feel embodied. The chapel became almost a school after the fact. Young painters could learn there by looking, and looking itself became a form of apprenticeship. Renaissance art often advanced in this way, through direct attention to earlier solutions preserved on walls where another generation had left its thought in pigment. Piero della Francesca brought measurement and stillness into one of the most distinctive artistic minds of the century. Born in Borgo San Sepolcro, he worked across central Italy, including Arezzo, Urbino, Rimini, and other courts and towns. His paintings often seem calm, not because they lack intelligence or feeling, but because emotion has been set inside order. In the legend of the true cross frescoes at Arezzo, figures, architecture, battle, dream, and ceremony occupy a world of lucid structure. Piero was also a mathematician, and his writing on perspective and solid geometry shows how closely artistic vision could sit beside abstract thought. There is a quiet importance in Piero's career. The Renaissance eye did not develop only through the desire to imitate nature. It also developed through the desire to measure, arrange, and understand nature. A face, a column, a town square. a soldier's body, a sleeping emperor, or a queen receiving a sacred sign could be placed within a world that seemed governed by proportion. This did not make art cold. It gave painted things a durable serenity, as though the visible world, properly studied, might disclose an order beneath its changes. Andrea del Verrocchio's workshop in Florence shows another side of the trained eye. Verrocchio was a sculptor, painter, goldsmith, and master whose shop produced objects, images, and artists. Among those associated with his workshop was Leonardo da Vinci, who entered as a young apprentice and learned in a place where drawing, metalwork, modeling, painting, and mechanical curiosity could meet. A goldsmith's training mattered because it required precision, patience, and attention to surface. The boundary between crafts was more porous than later categories suggest. Sculpture, painting, engineering, ornament, and design often grew from overlapping habits of hand. Domenico Ghirlandaio's workshop offers yet another view of the system. His frescoes in Florence, including the Tornabuoni Chapel in Santa Maria Novella, placed sacred stories within richly observed social worlds. Florentine patrons, clothing, interiors, faces, and ceremonies entered biblical narratives without abolishing their religious purpose. A patron family could see itself folded into sacred history, not as a crude intrusion, but as part of the painting's social function. In Ghirlandaio's shop, the young Michelangelo received early training, and through that training he entered a lineage of drawing, fresco, discipline, and public work before his later reputation made him seem solitary. Contracts kept all this grounded. Patrons might specify the subject, the size, the number of figures, the quality of materials, the deadline, the payment schedule, and even the use of the artist's own hand in important sections. Disputes could arise when work was delayed or when materials seemed inadequate. Art belonged to devotion and honor, but also to negotiation. The beauty that survives in museums and churches often began in documents concerned with money, obligation, and trust. Workshop practice also explains why Renaissance style spread unevenly and powerfully. Assistants trained under a master carried habits elsewhere. Drawings circulated. Patrons requested work in a manner they had admired in another chapel or city. Courts competed for artists already praised by rivals. A painter who had studied Masaccio, Fra Angelico, Piero, or Verrocchio did not copy them mechanically, but absorbed solutions that could be altered and extended. The Renaissance was therefore not a single invention, but a network of trained eyes recognizing and revising one another's discoveries. Near the end of the 15th century, this network had grown strong enough to produce figures whose fame later seemed to exceed the world that formed them. Leonardo's notebooks, Michelangelo's anatomy, Raphael's compositional grace, and many later achievements depended on the patient foundations of guild, shop, drawing, copying, contract, and material preparation. The artist as genius did not replace the artist as craftsman all at once. The two identities overlapped, and the tension between them became one of the defining features of Renaissance art. From these workshops and guilds, the story now turns toward the courts, where rulers and noble families shaped art for another purpose. In Urbino, Mantua, Ferrara, Milan, and other centers of power, painting, music, books, architecture, manners, and diplomacy gathered around princely households, and the trained eye learned to serve not only the city and the chapel, but the careful theater of rule. Chapter 5. Urbino, Mantua, Ferrara, and the courtly mind. Urbino sat high in the hills of the Marchi, smaller than Florence, poorer than Venice, and less commanding than Milan. Yet, in the later 15th century, it became one of the most carefully fashioned courts in Italy. Its importance did not come from size. It came from the way its ruler, Federico da Montefeltro, made power appear disciplined, learned, and almost architectural. Federico was a soldier by profession, a condottiere who earned wealth through war and contract, but he wished to be remembered as more than a successful captain. His palace, library, portraits, and studiolo shaped an image of rule in which arms and letters stood together, each one correcting the other's roughness. Federico's life itself carried the mixture of calculation and cultivation that courtly Renaissance power often required. Born in 1422, he became Lord and later Duke of Urbino, and his military service for different Italian powers gave him both money and political reach. A wound or injury had altered his face, leaving him with the distinctive profile that later portraits preserved, and he was often shown from the side that displayed his strong nose and single visible eye. In Piero della Francesca's famous diptych, Federico and his wife Battista Sforza face one another across a painted space of pale landscape and distant hills. The portraits are formal, restrained, and political, but they also preserve the strange intimacy of dynastic memory. The palace at Urbino became the clearest expression of Federico's ambition. It was not built merely to shelter a household or impress visitors with bulk. Its courtyards, rooms, stairways, and views were arranged to suggest order, intelligence, and measured command. Luciano Lorana and Francesco di Giorgio Martini both belong to its architectural history, and the building made Urbino feel like a place where military authority had passed through the discipline of geometry and taste. Renaissance courts often tried to make power beautiful, but Urbino gave that effort unusual coherence. The palace looked less like accidental accumulation and more like a mind made habitable. Inside it, Federico's studiolo offered one of the most revealing rooms of the Italian Renaissance. Its walls were covered with intricate intarsia, wood inlay arranged to resemble cupboards, books, musical instruments, armor, scientific tools, and small objects of learned life. The illusion was quiet and exact. Shelves that were not shelves seemed to hold things that were not really there, and the room became a private theater of cultivation. Federico, the soldier ruler, surrounded himself with signs of study, measurement, music, memory, and ancient example. A sword might win a city's security, but a book could help explain why that security deserved honor. This was not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was self-fashioning, and self-fashioning was one of the courtly Renaissance's central arts. A ruler had to appear brave, prudent, generous, devout, literate, disciplined, magnificently housed, and able to attract excellent men. The court gathered secretaries, tutors, musicians, painters, architects, soldiers, diplomats, pages, ladies, confessors, physicians, and servants into a single organism of rank and performance. Manners mattered because they translated hierarchy into daily movement. A badly chosen word, a delayed letter, a clumsy entrance, or an insult at table could disturb the surface that courts worked so carefully to preserve. Mantua offered a different but related example under the Gonzaga. Smaller powers often survived through flexibility, marriage alliances, military service, and cultivated visibility, and the Gonzaga understood the usefulness of art in that fragile balance. Andrea Mantegna came to Mantua in the 15th century and gave the court some of its most enduring images. In the Camera degli Sposi, or camera picta. He painted members of the Gonzaga family, courtiers, servants, and architectural illusion in a room where the walls seem to open and the ceiling appears to dissolve upward into painted sky. The effect was not only decorative, it placed the ruling family inside an invented world of dignity, presence, and controlled observation. Mantegna's art carried the weight of antiquity in another register. He loved hard forms, Roman fragments, sculptural bodies, inscriptions, triumphs, and severe spatial arrangements. His knowledge of ancient art did not produce softness. It gave his work a carved intensity, as though painted figures had learned something from stone reliefs and broken marbles. In Mantua, this suited a court that wished to appear both anciently grounded and actively powerful. The Renaissance use of antiquity varied from city to city. In one place, it polished language. In another, it shaped architecture. In Mantua, through Mantegna, it often gave painting the memory of Roman firmness. Ferrara, ruled by the Este family, had its own character, refined, literary, musical, and dynastic. The Este court cultivated romance, chivalric memory, humanist learning, and elaborate spectacle. Borso d'Este, Ercole I, and later Alfonso belonged to a ruling house that understood how art and ceremony could give a relatively small state an outsized cultural presence. Ferrara's painters developed a style often marked by sharp detail, bright invention, and courtly strangeness, while its poets and musicians gave the city a reputation that reached beyond its political strength. In such a place, culture was not a luxury added after rule. It was one of the means by which rule appeared legitimate. Rimini, under Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta, showed the darker and more unstable side of the same courtly ambition. Sigismondo was a soldier, patron, and ruler with a reputation for violence and political danger. Yet he also sponsored one of the most unusual monuments of the Renaissance, the Tempio Malatestiano. Leon Battista Alberti redesigned the Church of San Francesco in Rimini with a classical language that turned a Christian building into something like a personal and dynastic memorial. Medals, inscriptions, paganizing details, and the presence of Sigismondo's beloved Isotta degli Atti gave the project a charged ambiguity. A church could become a statement of faith, family, classical aspiration, and personal desire all at once. Milan, larger and more militarized, belonged to another scale of power. The Visconti and then the Sforza ruled a city whose wealth, fortifications, armies, and administrative reach made it one of the major forces of northern Italy. Ludovico Sforza, called Il Moro, made his court a place of artistic and intellectual ambition, drawing figures such as Leonardo da Vinci and Bramante into his service. Milan's Renaissance was shaped not by republican debate or small court elegance alone, but by dynastic authority and the need to display strength in a dangerous political field. Art there served ceremony, engineering, architecture, portraiture, pageantry, and the image of command. Among the great courtly figures of this world, Isabella d'Este stands apart for the clarity of her taste and the persistence of her correspondence. Born into the Este family in Ferrara and married to Francesco Gonzaga of Mantua, she became one of the most active patrons and collectors of her age. Her letters show not a vague love of beauty, but a disciplined pursuit of objects, images, performances, books, antiquities, and artists. She pressed painters for delivery, negotiated subjects, asked after materials, complained of delay, and measured reputation carefully. Patronage, in her hands, was not passive admiration. It was management, Isabella's studiolo and grotta in Mantua became spaces where collecting, mythology, antiquity, and personal identity came together. She sought works from artists such as Mantegna, Perugino, Lorenzo Costa, and later Titian, and she wanted them to fit an intellectual program that reflected her own cultivated persona. Her collecting included medals, cameos, ancient objects, musical instruments, manuscripts, and paintings. These possessions were not merely beautiful things arranged in private satisfaction. They formed a language through which a noble woman could display learning, taste, judgment, and political subtlety in a world where formal power was often male. Her career also shows how letters held courtly Italy together. Messages moved constantly among courts, ambassadors, artists, relatives, agents, and merchants. A painting delayed in one city could become the subject of repeated pressure from another. A proposed marriage required discreet inquiry, financial negotiation, and symbolic gifts. A musician, dwarf, horse, jewel, manuscript, or antique statue could become part of diplomatic exchange. Courts did not operate only through armies and treaties. They operated through objects, favors, performances, and carefully preserved relationships. Baldassare Castiglione later gave this world its most famous literary self-portrait in the Book of the Courtier, first published in 1528 but set in the remembered court of Urbino. Castiglione had served in courts and diplomacy, and his book takes the form of refined conversation about the qualities of the ideal courtier. The courtier should be noble, graceful, skilled in arms, learned in letters, able in music and speech, loyal to his prince, and careful never to make effort appear effortful. The famous ideal of sprezzatura, an art that conceals art, captured something essential about courtly Renaissance culture. Discipline had to become ease before it could be admired. The courtier is valuable partly because it is polished enough to reveal the pressure beneath polish. The ideal figure it describes lives under constant judgment. He must please without seeming servile, advise without offending, display skill without vanity, and move through a hierarchy where favor can rise or disappear. The same was true, in altered form, for court artists. A painter or architect needed talent, but also patience with patrons, awareness of rank, skill in negotiation, and the ability to make another person's ambition visible. Court culture softened power on the surface, but it rarely made power less demanding. Princely courts also changed the scale and subject of art. Republican Florence had made much of civic religious space, public sculpture, and guild-sponsored monuments. Courts favored portraits, palace rooms, studioli, dynastic chapels, mythological cycles, temporary festivals, wedding spectacles, and carefully managed images of family continuity. A ruler wished to appear not only devout, but anciently rooted, learned, victorious, generous, and worthy of alliance. The artist became a maker of visible legitimacy. Even music, clothing, banquets, and ceremonial entrances belonged to the same broad art of presentation. Women at court played a more complex role than formal political titles alone would suggest. Marriages bound states, dowries moved wealth, and noble women often served as cultural brokers between families and cities. Isabella d'Este's influence was unusually visible, but she was not alone in using correspondence, taste, and household management as instruments of power. Battista Sforza, Elisabetta Gonzaga, Beatrice d'Este, and others belonged to a world in which female education, patronage, diplomacy, and dynastic duty could overlap. Their positions remained constrained, but within those constraints they shaped memory, art, and alliance. The courtly Renaissance, then, was not merely a more elegant chapter after the workshop. It was a different environment for the same energies: antiquity, reputation, skill, money, devotion, and political calculation. In Urbino, books and inlaid wood gave a soldier's rule a learned face. In Mantua, painted rooms and collected objects arranged family identity into durable images. In Ferrara, poetry, music, and spectacle gave a small state cultural reach. In Milan, artists and engineers served a harsher dynastic machine. Together, these courts taught Renaissance culture how to move through manners, letters, portraits, libraries, festivals, and rooms designed to make authority appear natural. The next figure in the story passed through both workshop and court, and his life shows how wide Renaissance service could become. Leonardo da Vinci learned in Florence among materials, drawing, and craft, then carried his restless attention to Milan, where an artist could offer paintings, machines, pageants, canals, weapons, anatomy, and marvels of observation to a ruler who needed brilliance to look useful as well as beautiful. Chapter 6: Leonardo and the Restless Mind. Leonardo da Vinci did not arrive in history as the finished emblem that later centuries made of him. He was born in 1452 near Vinci, a small Tuscan town west of Florence, the illegitimate son of Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary, and Caterina, a woman about whom the record remains thinner than curiosity would like. Illegitimacy did not remove him from his father's household connections, but it did shape the limits of his formal path. He did not become a notary like Ser Piero, and he did not pass through the full Latin education that trained many humanists. His learning would come through looking, drawing, testing, listening, dismantling, comparing, and returning to the same problem until its surface began to open. Florence gave him the workshop world before it gave him fame. As a young man, Leonardo entered the orbit of Andrea del Verrocchio, whose shop gathered painting, sculpture, metalwork, design, and mechanical skill into one disciplined environment. A boy in such a place learned that beauty was never separated from preparation. Panels had to be smoothed, pigments ground, drawings copied, clay modeled, metal understood, draperies studied, and faces watched with patience. Verrocchio's training mattered because it did not encourage a narrow art. It gave Leonardo a world where the hand could move from a painted angel to a bronze form, from a festival device to an engineered object, from the curve of hair to the tension of a horse's body. Florentine art in Leonardo's youth had already inherited Brunelleschi's space, Donatello's bodily presence, Masaccio's gravity, and the workshop discipline of drawing from life. Yet Leonardo's attention rested strangely on transitions rather than fixed forms. He studied how water curled, how smoke dispersed, how hair twisted, how muscles pulled beneath skin, how expressions altered by tiny degrees, and how light softened the edge between one thing and another. This was not distraction. It was a different kind of fidelity. Many artists wanted to place the world convincingly before the eye. Leonardo wanted to understand the motions and causes that made the world appear as it did. His early paintings already show that tendency toward living surfaces. The Annunciation, associated with his early career, gives the angel and virgin a composed sacred setting, but it also lingers over botanical detail, wings, folds, and the meeting of bodies with air. In works connected with Verrocchio's shop, later tradition noticed Leonardo's hand in the Angel of the Baptism of Christ, where the softness of modeling seemed to belong to a younger painter whose way of seeing differed from the master's harder clarity. Stories that Verrocchio gave up painting after seeing Leonardo's skill are best treated gently, because they sound like later legend. Their persistence still reveals how strongly posterity wanted Leonardo's talent to appear as something that quietly displaced what came before it. In 1482, Leonardo left Florence for Milan, and the move changed the scale of his life. Florence was republican, competitive, and dense with workshops and families. Milan under Ludovico Sforza belonged to a larger courtly and dynastic world, where military strength, ceremony, engineering, architecture, music, and political display carried great weight. Leonardo's famous letter to Ludovico presented him first not as a painter, but as a maker of useful and impressive devices. He offered designs for bridges, siege machines, cannon, armored vehicles, fortifications, water systems, and instruments of war. Only near the end did he add that in painting he could do as well as any man. The letter is revealing because it shows Leonardo entering the court through usefulness. A Renaissance artist could not always survive by beauty alone, and at Milan, beauty itself often had to appear serviceable to power. Ludovico needed spectacles, machines, portraits, monuments, designs, military imagination, and the aura of having rare talent near him. Leonardo, in turn, needed patronage, income, materials, and problems large enough for his mind. His self-presentation was not modest, but it was carefully adapted to the needs of a ruler whose position depended on both force and magnificence. Milan gave Leonardo years of varied work. He planned court entertainments, designed costumes and mechanical devices, advised on engineering, studied canals and water movement, made portraits, imagined equestrian monuments, and filled notebooks with observations that did not always lead to finished commissions. The court valued marvels, and Leonardo could provide them, but his notebooks suggest that external tasks often became doors into private inquiry. A canal problem led to the behavior of water. A horse monument led to anatomy, balance, casting, and motion. A face led to expression, proportion, age, and the hidden motions of feeling. The portrait, known as Lady with an Ermine, usually identified as Cecilia Gallerani, Ludovico Sforza's mistress, shows how court portraiture could become something more than likeness. Cecilia turns slightly, holding the animal against her body, and the movement gives the painting a poised, alert life. The ermine carries emblematic meanings connected to purity, status, and perhaps Ludovico himself, but the painting's force lies also in the relation between hand, animal, gaze, and turning body. Leonardo made status appear alive through motion held in suspension. The court received its symbol. The painter studied attention itself. The great Milanese commission was The Last Supper, painted for the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie in the 1490s. Leonardo did not treat the wall as a conventional fresco in the safest technical manner. He experimented with materials, seeking effects of modeling and revision that Buonfresco did not easily permit. The result was beautiful and unstable. The painting began to deteriorate early, and its fragility became part of its history almost from the start. In the refectory, Christ and the apostles occupy a measured space that seems to extend the room, while the announcement of betrayal passes through the table in waves of gesture, shock, questioning, and inward recognition. The scene's drama is controlled rather than loud. Leonardo placed the figures in groups, giving each apostle a distinct response while keeping the whole composition balanced around the stillness of Christ. Hands open, bodies lean, heads turn, and speech seems to move across the table without needing to be quoted. The painting shows Leonardo's deepest strength as a narrative artist. He could make an invisible psychological moment visible through bodies arranged in space. Betrayal becomes not a single gesture, but a disturbance passing through a human company. At the same time, the Last Supper reveals the cost of experiment. Leonardo's search for subtle surface, shadow, and revision worked against the durability expected of wall painting. Later restorers, monks, soldiers, damp, time, and damage all altered what survived. This does not make the work less important. It makes it more characteristic of him. Leonardo often preferred inquiry to completion, and even when he finished a work, the method could carry instability inside it. He wanted more from materials than they were willing to give. His notebooks are the broadest record of that desire, written often in mirror script, moving from right to left. They contain drawings of machines, water, skulls, muscles, plants, weapons, flying devices, gears, architecture, storms, faces, measurements, jokes, lists, and questions. They are not organized like modern scientific publications, and they should not be treated as if Leonardo had created finished sciences in every field he touched. Their greatness lies elsewhere, in the patient range of attention. He believed that sight, when disciplined by drawing and reason, could become a path toward understanding. Anatomy drew him with particular force. He studied bones, muscles, organs, the proportions of the body, the movement of limbs, the structure of the skull, the fetus in the womb, and the heart's valves. Some of this work depended on dissection, an activity that required access, opportunity, and a temperament able to look steadily where custom often hesitated. His anatomical drawings are astonishing, not because they are always correct by later standards, but because they combine artistic clarity with investigative seriousness. The body, for Leonardo, was not only a form to be represented, it was a machine of life whose visible motions hinted at hidden structures. Water was another lifelong subject. He studied currents, eddies, floods, channels, erosion, and the movement of rivers around obstacles. In Milan and later elsewhere, this interest had practical uses in canals, irrigation, and military engineering, but it also touched his larger sense that nature moved through patterns. Hair curling beside a face, water turning around a stone, smoke rising, and blood moving through the body could seem to belong to related families of motion. This habit of comparison made his thought fertile and sometimes unfinishable. One subject opened into another before the first had closed. The fall of Ludovico Sforza changed Leonardo's life abruptly. In 1499, French forces entered Milan, and the political world that had supported him began to break. The great equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza, which Leonardo had planned on an enormous scale, was never cast in bronze. A clay model had existed, admired for its ambition, but war and political collapse left the project unfinished. For an artist dependent on courts, the failure of a patron could scatter years of work. Leonardo's career, like the Renaissance itself, remained vulnerable to armies, alliances, and dynastic miscalculation. After leaving Milan, Leonardo moved through several places, including Mantua, Venice, and eventually Florence again. In 1502, he entered the service of Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, whose campaigns in central Italy were watched closely by diplomats and feared by many cities. Leonardo served as a military engineer and mapmaker, inspecting fortifications and producing plans with the careful eye he brought to other problems. The association did not turn him into a man of violence in the narrative sense. It shows rather how Renaissance intelligence could be drawn into the practical needs of power. Measurement could serve beauty, and it could serve war. Cesare Borgia's world also brings Leonardo near Machiavelli, who observed Borgia's methods as a Florentine envoy. The meeting of such figures was not accidental. Renaissance Italy was small enough, and its crises concentrated enough, that artists, engineers, diplomats, rulers, and writers often crossed the same political ground. A map, a fortress, a letter, a portrait, and a military report could belong to the same moment of history. Leonardo's mobility across these roles makes him seem modern, but it also makes him deeply Renaissance, because the age had not yet hardened the boundaries between artist, technician, observer, and servant of power. Back in Florence, Leonardo worked on projects that again reveal the mixture of ambition and incompletion around him. His Battle of Anghiari, commissioned for the Palazzo Vecchio, was intended to stand near Michelangelo's planned Battle of Cassina, creating a civic contest of artistic greatness on the walls of Florentine government. Leonardo's experimental technique failed, and the work did not survive as intended. Yet even its failure became legendary, carried through copies, descriptions, and the memory of violently turning horses and men rendered by a painter fascinated by motion. The city received not the completed monument it expected, but another sign of Leonardo's unstable greatness. During these years, he also began the portrait now known as the Mona Lisa, usually identified as Lisa Gherardini, wife of the Florentine merchant Francesco del Giocondo. The painting's later fame has made it difficult to see calmly, but within Leonardo's life it belongs to his long study of expression, atmosphere, flesh, and inward presence. The sitter turns toward the viewer with a composure that does not settle into a single readable mood. Behind her, the landscape seems ancient, watery, and remote, shaped less like a setting than a world of slow geological thought. The portrait is small compared with the myths built around it, yet its quietness has carried an extraordinary afterlife. Leonardo spent his later years moving again, returning to Milan under French rule, studying, drawing, advising, and eventually accepting the invitation of Francis I of France. He died in 1519 at Amboise, far from the Tuscan town where his life had begun. The works he left were few compared with the scale of his reputation, and many of his projects remained incomplete, damaged, dispersed, or private in notebooks. Yet the incompletion is not merely a weakness. It belongs to the shape of a mind that treated the world as inexhaustible. Leonardo's story widens the Renaissance because it refuses to keep art in one chamber. In him, painting touched anatomy, engineering, optics, theatre, hydrology, warfare, courtly service, and philosophical wonder. He needed patrons, but he also exceeded the uses patrons had for him. He belonged to Florence's workshop culture and Milan's courtly ambition, to sacred painting and military design, to beautiful surfaces and hidden structures. The next movement carries the story to Rome, where popes would gather artists of this scale into projects even larger and more public, turning ruins, chapels, basilicas, and papal rooms into monuments of spiritual authority and worldly power. Chapter 7: Papal Rome and Monumental Ambition. Rome entered the Renaissance differently from Florence, Urbino, Mantua, or Milan. It was not a single workshop city, nor a small court carefully arranged around a ruler's household, nor a commercial republic where guilds and banking families gave public art its strongest frame. It was the seat of the papacy, the guardian of relics and shrines, the city of Peter and Paul, and also the broken heir of ancient empire. Its streets moved among ruins, churches, noble fortresses, processional routes, markets, pilgrims, and fragments of marble whose former meanings had often faded into later use. In Rome, the Renaissance did not merely recover antiquity, it had to live among antiquity's remains. The papacy had returned from Avignon in the later 14th century and then endured the Great Schism when rival claimants to the papal office divided Western Christendom. That history mattered because 15th century popes inherited an office of immense spiritual claim but damaged visible authority. Rome itself needed repair, not only as a physical city but as a symbol. Roads, bridges, churches, chapels, libraries, palaces, and ceremonies all became part of papal self-presentation. A pope who restored buildings or summoned great artists was not only expressing taste, he was making an argument in stone, paint, and urban order that the center of Latin Christendom had regained its force. Sixtus IV, Pope from 1471 to 1484, helped set this pattern before the more famous age of Julius II and Leo X. He restored churches, supported scholarship, strengthened papal administration, and gave his name to the Sistine Chapel, built as the chapel of the papal household. The chapel's walls were painted by artists from Florence and Umbria, including Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, and Pinturicchio, whose frescoes arranged scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ in a learned sequence of sacred authority. Even before Michelangelo touched the ceiling, the room had become a papal statement. It placed scripture, ceremony, and institutional continuity inside a single architectural body. Rome's antique remains gave Renaissance artists and patrons a language no other city possessed in the same way. Columns, arches, sarcophagi, inscriptions, statues, and broken walls stood as evidence of a power that had once ordered the Mediterranean world. Christian Rome could not simply become pagan Rome again, nor did it wish to do so. The work was subtler. Popes and artists borrowed ancient scale, form, and memory to magnify Christian authority. A basilica could recall imperial grandeur while serving the apostles' tomb. A papal palace could contain frescoes of philosophers and theologians under the same roof as administrative offices and ceremonial rooms. Rome was both ruin and project. Florence, meanwhile, had briefly offered a severe warning about the dangers of worldly magnificence. Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican preacher who rose to power there after the expulsion of the Medici in 1494, denounced corruption, luxury, vanity, and moral decay with unusual force. His followers organized reforms, and the famous burnings of luxury goods and objects associated with vanity became part of the city's memory. Savonarola's Florence did not reject all art, but it demanded that art serve religious purification rather than worldly display. For a short time, the city that had nurtured elegant patronage and humanist brilliance bent toward penitential intensity. Savonarola's fall was as public as his rise. His conflict with Pope Alexander VI, his political entanglements, and the instability of his authority in Florence led to his excommunication, arrest, torture, and execution in 1498. The physical details need not be lingered over. What mattered historically was the lesson his career left behind. Renaissance culture could not be understood as a simple march towards secular confidence. Calls for reform, fear of corruption, anxiety over luxury, and the demand for religious seriousness lived inside the same world that produced palaces, portraits, libraries, and mythological paintings. Julius II, who became Pope in 1503, moved in almost the opposite direction from Savonarola. He was a della Rovera, nephew of Sixtus IV, and he brought to the papacy a temperament marked by political ambition, military energy, and a desire for visible greatness. He wanted to restore papal territories, strengthen papal authority, and remake Rome as a capital worthy of his office. Later memory often calls him the warrior pope, and the phrase is not accidental, though it can make him seem simpler than he was. Julius understood that power had to be seen, and he gathered artists whose works could make papal ambition appear universal, ancient, and sacred at once. The rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica was the largest architectural sign of that ambition. The old Constantinian basilica, venerable and beloved, had stood for more than 1,000 years over the traditional burial place of St. Peter, but by Julius's time it was aging and structurally troubled. Donato Bramante proposed a new building of vast scale, drawing on centralized forms, classical order, and monumental planning. To replace the old basilica was not a small decision. It meant disturbing memory in order to make a grander future, and many contemporaries felt the weight of that loss. Yet Julius pressed forward because a renewed papacy seemed to require a renewed architectural body. Bramante's St. Peter's was never completed in his own form, and the basilica's long construction would pass through many hands after him, including Raphael, Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, Michelangelo, and later architects. Still, the project changed Rome immediately. Money, labor, stone, plans, criticism, indulgence preaching, and artistic rivalry gathered around it. The building became a physical center of Renaissance ambition and Reformation grievance alike. A church meant to proclaim apostolic majesty also exposed the financial and moral tensions of the institution that built it. Julius's relationship with Michelangelo Buonarroti brought another part of this ambition to the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo had already gained extraordinary reputation through works such as the Pietà in Rome and the David in Florence. He thought of himself most deeply as a sculptor, and Julius first drew him into the design of a monumental papal tomb, a project that would trouble Michelangelo for decades. The Sistine Ceiling Commission grew out of this difficult relationship between patron and artist, desire and frustration, command and resistance. Michelangelo did not approach the ceiling as a simple act of grateful obedience. He had to be pressed, persuaded, and bound into a work he had not originally sought. The labor was immense. Michelangelo worked high above the chapel floor on scaffolding, designing and painting a vast program that ranged through Genesis, prophets, Sibyls, ancestors of Christ, and monumental human forms that seemed to carry thought in their bodies. The ceiling was not a quiet decorative surface. It became a world of creation, fall, promise, and expectation, held within the ceremonial heart of papal worship. The famous image of the creation of Adam belongs to this larger structure, but the ceiling's force does not rest on one scene alone. It lies in the relation between human form and divine history, between painted anatomy and sacred time. Michelangelo's bodies gave the chapel a new intensity. They were not soft devotional figures arranged only for pious recognition. They twisted, rested, reached, bore weight, and occupied their painted spaces with sculptural strength. This was not a rejection of Christianity. It was a Christian imagination passing through the study of the body with unusual seriousness. The Renaissance had learned from antiquity, from anatomy, from sculpture, and from workshop drawing, and in Michelangelo those lessons entered a sacred room with almost overwhelming confidence. While Michelangelo worked above, Raphael transformed the papal apartments nearby. Younger, socially graceful, and able to absorb influence with remarkable ease, Raphael served Julius II and then Leo X in rooms that joined theology, philosophy, law, poetry, and papal authority. The School of Athens, painted in the Stanza della Signatura, placed ancient philosophers inside an ideal architectural setting, with Plato and Aristotle near the center and many other figures arranged in conversation, inquiry, and recognition. The fresco did not make papal Rome pagan. It presented ancient wisdom as something gathered, ordered, and contained within the intellectual world of the papal palace. Raphael's achievement suited Rome's ambition in a different way from Michelangelo's. Michelangelo made bodies seem to bear the strain of creation and judgment. Raphael made thought appear sociable, harmonious, and architecturally clear. In his rooms, the papacy could imagine itself as the inheritor and guardian of all legitimate wisdom: Christian, classical, legal, poetic, and philosophical. The frescoes were beautiful, but they were also institutional images. They made the Pope's residence look like the place where the scattered dignities of history had come to be arranged. Leo X, elected in 1513, brought the Medici into the papacy. He was the son of Lorenzo de' Medici and had grown up within the cultivated world of Florentine humanism, music, poetry, collecting, and political management. Under Leo, Rome's artistic life remained brilliant, but the financial pressures around papal magnificence sharpened. St. Peter's still required money. Papal ceremony, offices, diplomacy, family advancement, war, and patronage all drew resources into a large and hungry system. The sale and preaching of indulgences, long part of late medieval religious life in various forms, became tied in public memory to the funding of St. Peter's and to the controversies that soon followed. Indulgences were not meant, in official theology, to sell forgiveness in the crude way later polemic sometimes suggested. They concerned remission of temporal punishment, the treasury of merits, confession, contrition, and the Church's authority to administer spiritual benefit. Yet the practice was easily abused, easily misunderstood, and easily resented when preached in ways that seemed to turn salvation into finance. In a Europe already marked by calls for reform, resentment of clerical wealth, humanist criticism, and local political tensions, indulgence preaching became combustible. Rome's beauty had begun to carry a cost that many outside Rome judged harshly. This is one of the central paradoxes of the High Renaissance. Some of the most admired works in European art were produced within institutions that many contemporaries believed needed reform. The same papal court that gathered Michelangelo, Raphael, Bramante, scholars, architects, and musicians also carried nepotism, financial pressure, diplomatic maneuver, and moral suspicion. The contradiction does not cancel the art, and the art does not erase the contradiction. They belong together, because Renaissance magnificence often grew where authority was both confident and anxious. Rome in the early 16th century, therefore, stood at a height that was also a point of strain. Artists arrived because the commissions were enormous and the patrons unmatched. Scholars came because libraries, offices, and powerful households needed learning. Builders reshaped the city because the papacy wanted a capital fit for its claims. Pilgrims still moved toward relics and holy places, while ambassadors measured every papal gesture for political meaning. Ancient ruins, Christian shrines, family palaces, half-built projects, and newly painted rooms made the city feel layered beyond any single interpretation. The careers of Michelangelo and Raphael also changed the meaning of artistic reputation. They were not anonymous servants. They were courted, compared, criticized, and remembered as figures whose individual manner mattered. Michelangelo's difficult temperament became part of his legend, while Raphael's grace and early death would later make him seem almost perfectly favored by fortune. The Renaissance artist had not ceased to depend on patronage, but patronage now depended increasingly on the artist's name. Fame had become a form of currency that patrons wished to possess. Julius II died in 1513, leaving projects unfinished and an image of papal greatness larger than the ordinary limits of one pontificate. Raphael died in 1520, still young, and Rome mourned him as though a rare harmony had been removed from the city. Michelangelo lived on, returning later to the Sistine Chapel for the Last Judgment under a different atmosphere, when reform, anxiety, and conflict had deepened. The High Renaissance did not end in one moment, but the confidence surrounding it slowly changed. Beauty remained, but it no longer stood in quite the same air. The next turn in the story begins with a different kind of multiplication. While Rome built upward and outward through stone, fresco, ceremony, and papal ambition, another force was spreading through Europe in smaller, repeatable forms. Sheets of paper, metal type, ink, presses, printed books, pamphlets, corrected texts, and arguments that could travel farther than any chapel wall. Chapter 8. Print, paper, and the multiplication of minds. Multiplication changed the Renaissance almost as deeply as painting, sculpture, or architecture did. A fresco remained where it was made, bound to a chapel wall, a palace room, or the inside of a civic building. A statue might travel if a patron ordered it elsewhere, but most great works of stone and bronze belonged to the places that paid for them. Books were different. Once printing matured, a text could pass through cities, courts, universities, monasteries, shops, fairs, and private studies with a speed and consistency that manuscript culture had never allowed. The Renaissance had begun by searching for old voices in fragile copies. Print made those voices less fragile and far more numerous. Johannes Gutenberg of Mainz stands near the beginning of this transformation, though printing itself did not come from nowhere. Europeans already knew block printing. Paper had been moving westward for centuries, and scribes, stationers, binders, rubricators, illuminators, and readers had created a large book culture before movable type altered its scale. Gutenberg's achievement lay in combining metal movable type, suitable ink, press technology, and careful production in a way that made repeatable printed books possible. The work required capital, secrecy, technical experiment, and skilled hands. It was not a single inspired gesture. It was a difficult craft system brought to a new level of coordination. The Gutenberg Bible, produced in the 1450s, reveals how new the technology was and how strongly it still respected the manuscript world. Its pages were arranged in columns, its type imitated formal script, and many copies received hand decoration after printing. A reader encountering it did not see a crude mechanical object replacing sacred tradition. The Bible was beautiful, expensive, and solemn. Yet beneath that beauty lay a change that could not be contained by beauty alone. Once the same page could be reproduced with unusual consistency, textual culture acquired a new foundation. That consistency mattered to scholars. Manuscripts varied, sometimes slightly and sometimes seriously, because copying by hand introduced omissions, additions, mistakes, corrections, and local habits. Humanists who searched for better versions of ancient texts had long known that one copy might preserve a reading another had lost. Print did not end error, and printers made mistakes of their own, but it changed the nature of correction. A printer could prepare an edition, compare manuscripts, set type, issue copies, and then see that edition move across Europe as a shared point of reference. Disagreement became easier because readers could argue over the same text. Mainz did not keep the new craft to itself. Printers and type spread into other German cities, then to Italy, France, the Low Countries, Spain, England, and beyond. Venice became one of the great centers of the printed book, helped by its commercial networks, wealth, paper supply, skilled labor, and position between Northern Europe, Italy, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The city had long known how to move goods. Printed books became another kind of cargo, And the ships, merchants, and agents that served trade could also serve learning. A book printed in Venice might find readers in Paris, Nuremberg, London, Krakow, or Seville. Aldus Manutius gave Venetian printing one of its most distinctive Renaissance forms. Born around the middle of the 15th century, trained in humanist learning, and active in Venice from the 1490s, Aldus dedicated his press to Greek and Latin texts, scholarship, and elegant production. He gathered editors and scholars around him, worked with Greek manuscripts and Greek-speaking assistants, and issued editions that helped classical learning travel in more reliable printed form. His printer's mark, the dolphin and anchor, became a sign of learned craftsmanship. The image suggested speed and steadiness together, which suited a press that wanted books to move quickly without surrendering care. Aldus also helped popularize the small octavo format for classical texts, books compact enough to be held and carried more easily than large scholarly volumes. This was not a trivial material change. A portable book altered the reader's relation to learning. Ancient authors could travel with students, secretaries, courtiers, and scholars in a more intimate way. The page became less tied to the library desk and more available to the hand. Italic type, associated with Alden editions, gave these books an elegant compression, saving space while creating a recognizable visual style. Form and intellectual ambition worked together. Venice's printing world was not isolated from commerce, censorship, competition, or error. Printers needed investment, paper, type, labor, correctors, privileges, and buyers. Editions could fail financially. Texts could be pirated. Mistakes in type could provoke embarrassment. Correction sheets and revised editions show a world in which scholarship and business constantly touched. The printed page may look calm after centuries on a shelf, but its production belonged to noisy workshops, negotiations, debts, deadlines, and arguments over accuracy. The book was an object of learning and a commodity at once. William Caxton brought printing to England in the 1470s after learning the trade on the continent. His press helped establish printed English prose at a moment when the language itself still carried regional variety and change. Caxton printed Chaucer, romances, chronicles, devotional works, and translations, and his choices helped shape what kinds of English texts circulated in more fixed form. In this way, printing did not merely spread old learning, it helped stabilize vernacular languages, giving written forms a wider authority than local speech could easily provide. Humanism benefited from print, but it also gave print much of its early purpose. Scholars wanted better editions of Cicero, Virgil, Livy, Aristotle, Plato, Plutarch, and the Church Fathers. Teachers needed school books. Universities needed texts. Courts wanted poetry, histories, and moral instruction. Lawyers and clerics needed reference works. Printers served all of these audiences, and in serving them, they helped create larger communities of readers who could recognize the same authors, cite the same passages, and join the same disputes. The Republic of Letters, already forming through manuscript exchange and correspondence, gained a more durable material body. Erasmus of Rotterdam stands at the center of this printed humanist world. Born in the late 1460s, trained in religious and scholarly settings, and constantly moving through Europe, Erasmus became famous through books, letters, satire, editions, and moral criticism. He belonged to no single city in the way Dante belonged to Florence or Leonardo to the memory of Florence and Milan. His world was Basel, Paris, Louvain, England, Italy, printers' shops, patrons' houses, and correspondence networks. He wrote with elegance, wit, caution, and extraordinary productivity, and print carried his voice farther than manuscript culture could have done. His praise of folly, first printed in 1511, used satire to criticize vanity, pedantry, superstition, clerical abuse, and human foolishness with a brilliance that made laughter serve moral unease. Yet Erasmus was not merely a satirist. He wanted Christian life renewed through learning, inner piety, scriptural attention, and moral seriousness. His humanism was Christian humanism, rooted in the belief that returning to better texts could help purify understanding. Ancient eloquence mattered, but so did the gospel, and the correction of language could become part of the correction of life. In 1516, Erasmus published his Greek New Testament with a new Latin translation. The work was imperfect, hurried in places, and later corrected, but its importance was immense. For centuries, Western Christianity had relied on the Latin Vulgate as its central scriptural text. Erasmus's edition encouraged scholars to return to the Greek, compare wording, and consider how translation shaped doctrine and devotion. A printed Greek New Testament did not by itself create religious fracture. It did, however, place textual scrutiny at the heart of Christian debate. And once sacred words were examined with humanist tools, old certainties could become more vulnerable. This is one of print's quiet powers. It did not create ideas from nothing. It made ideas repeatable, searchable, comparable, and portable. A sermon could become a pamphlet. A university dispute could become a public controversy. A scholar's correction could circulate beyond the small circle that first heard it. Authority had always depended partly on control over texts, teaching, and interpretation. Print widened the field on which that control had to operate. Martin Luther entered that widened field in 1517, when he challenged the preaching and theology of indulgences associated with Johann Tetzel and the wider financial structures of the Church. The 95 Theses were written in Latin for academic disputation, but they soon moved beyond that world. Printers recognized the force of the controversy, and Luther's writings began to circulate rapidly in Latin and German. The speed mattered. Earlier reformers had criticized the Church before him, and some had died for it. Luther's moment differed because print allowed argument, reply, attack, sermon, translation, and image to multiply with unusual force. Pamphlets became the small vessels of this transformation. They were cheaper than large books, quicker to produce, and easier to distribute. A reader did not need to own a great library to encounter controversy. Printers, booksellers, students, preachers, merchants, and travelers helped carry texts from town to town. Woodcuts could make arguments visible to readers with limited education, while vernacular prose drew religious debate into languages people spoke and heard. The Renaissance love of eloquence and recovery of texts had opened doors that religious controversy now passed through with unsettling energy. Luther's German Bible, published in stages and completed in 1534, further showed how print and vernacular language could reshape religious life. Translation was not only a technical act, it gave Scripture a new relation to households, churches, schools, and regional identities. The printed Bible could be read aloud, discussed, memorized, owned, and contested in ways that altered the balance between clergy, laity, university theologians, princes, and city councils. The book became a place where spiritual authority and political authority met. Images also multiplied. Dürer's prints had already shown how engraved or woodcut images could travel beyond the unique painting. In the Reformation, printed images served devotion, satire, propaganda, instruction, and attack. They could mock clerics, exalt reformers, explain doctrine, or carry apocalyptic warning. The Renaissance eye, trained in workshops and courts, now entered the printed sheet. Art was no longer confined to chapel, palace, or panel. It could pass into the hands of a much broader public, sometimes refined, sometimes crude, but always capable of movement. Catholic authorities and reforming critics both understood that print had to be answered. Censorship, indexes, privileges, licenses, official editions, and polemical replies all emerged as attempts to shape the flood rather than deny it. The Council of Trent would later respond to the crisis of reform in doctrine, discipline, and art. But the earlier 16th century already showed the difficulty of governing a culture in which texts could outrun permission. A sentence once printed could be condemned, but it could also be reprinted elsewhere. Control had not vanished, but it had become more laborious. For Renaissance humanists, print offered triumph and danger together. It preserved ancient texts, spread Greek learning, widened education, and gave scholars new tools. It also made error more durable when printed carelessly, made polemic more public, and allowed reputations to rise or fall across great distances. Petrarch had searched for Cicero in manuscripts. Erasmus corrected scripture through printed scholarship. Luther's controversy moved through presses faster than bishops and princes could contain. The same material force served beauty, learning, devotion, mockery, anger, reform, and division. By the early 16th century, Europe's mental world had become harder to localize. A painter might still need a wall, a sculptor might still need marble, and a pope might still need a basilica, but a printed argument could travel with less ceremony. The Renaissance had once depended on patrons gathering manuscripts and artists into chosen rooms. Print opened those rooms, imperfectly and unevenly, to readers who would never meet the patron, see the original manuscript, or stand before the fresco. The next part of the story returns to the famous artists, but in a changed atmosphere. Michelangelo and Raphael did not merely make beautiful works. They helped shape the idea of the artist as a public figure whose name could travel, whose life could be written, and whose fame could become part of history. Print, biography, papal Rome, and civic memory all joined in making genius itself into one of the Renaissance's most lasting creations. Chapter 9. Michelangelo, Raphael, and the Making of Genius. Michelangelo Buonarroti and Raphael of Urbino became more than great artists while they were still close enough to their own time for admiration to harden into legend. Their careers did not create the Renaissance, and they did not stand outside the systems that had formed earlier painters, sculptors, architects, and patrons. Michelangelo had learned through drawing, carving, anatomy, and the stubborn labor of hand against stone. Raphael had learned through Perugino, Urbino, Florence, and Rome, absorbing the achievements of others with a grace that made influence seem almost effortless. Yet together, and in different ways, they helped Europe imagine the artist as a public figure whose individual manner, temperament, biography, and fame could matter almost as much as the work itself. Michelangelo was born in 1475 in the small Tuscan town of Caprese and raised partly in Florence, where the memory of civic pride and Medici patronage shaped his early world. He entered the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, but his deepest artistic identity turned towards sculpture, and especially toward the ancient and modern study of the body. In the Medici garden, associated with Lorenzo de' Medici, he encountered antique fragments, learned company, and the idea that sculpture could join classical inheritance to Christian and civic ambition. The young artist did not become gentle through this education. His later life suggests a man of fierce discipline, difficult pride, religious intensity, and almost relentless dissatisfaction with ordinary limits. The David brought Michelangelo's name into Florentine public life with extraordinary force. The marble block from which it was carved had already been worked and abandoned before he received it, and this fact became part of the statue's later aura. From an imperfect and difficult stone, Michelangelo drew a figure of tense youth, watchful strength, and bodily clarity. When the statue was completed in 1504, Florence placed it not high on the cathedral, where an earlier plan might have sent it, but before the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of republican government. David became more than the biblical shepherd who faced Goliath. He became an image through which Florence could see its own vulnerable courage. The unveiling of the David was therefore a civic event as well as an artistic one. Florentine citizens and officials debated where it should stand, and the decision to place it in a political center gave the body a public language. The statue's nudity carried the authority of antique form, but its subject remained scriptural. Its beauty served neither pagan imitation nor Christian devotion alone. It stood between them, held by the city's need to imagine itself brave, chosen, and alert. This is one reason Renaissance art resists simple categories. A single body in marble could carry theology, classical memory, anatomical study, republican self-image, and the fame of the artist who made it. Raphael entered this world from another direction. Born Raffaello Sanzio in Urbino in 1483, he grew up in a courtly environment where painting, poetry, manners, and cultivated ease belonged to the atmosphere of rule. His father, Giovanni Santi, was a painter and poet at the court of Federico da Montefeltro and then Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, and Raphael inherited not only artistic training but social fluency. He studied the work of Perugino, whose clear compositions and gentle devotional figures gave him an early foundation. In Florence, he absorbed Leonardo's softness, Michelangelo's force, and the city's experiments in composition, but he rarely seemed crushed by influence. He transformed what he learned into balance. This ability became essential in Rome. Under Julius II and Leo X, Raphael managed large commissions, assistants, designs, portraits, tapestries, architecture, antiquities, and papal expectations with remarkable ease. The School of Athens remains the best-known image of this talent, but its calm should not make the achievement seem simple. To arrange ancient philosophers within a monumental space, to give them movement without disorder, difference without fragmentation, and intellectual dignity without stiffness, required both invention and tact. Raphael's genius often lay in making difficult synthesis appear natural. The difference between Michelangelo and Raphael became part of Renaissance memory. Michelangelo seemed solitary, inward, sculptural, severe, and often burdened by conflict. Raphael seemed gracious, social, harmonious, and able to coordinate large artistic enterprises without losing clarity. These contrasts were sharpened by later writers, but they rested on genuine differences of temperament and work. A patron might desire Michelangelo for overwhelming force, or Raphael for ordered beauty. Rome, rich enough and ambitious enough, could use both. The papal city made their differences visible because it placed their works near one another within the same vast project of authority. Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling had already shown what bodily imagination could do inside sacred history. Its prophets, sibyls, ignudi, ancestors, and scenes from Genesis gave human form a theological scale that still unsettles easy description. Raphael's papal rooms, by contrast, gathered knowledge into composed communities. Theology, philosophy, poetry, and law became visible as ordered fields of thought. The two artists were not merely decorating Rome, they were helping the papacy present itself as heir to scripture, antiquity, wisdom, and universal power, even as the institution's political and moral tensions deepened around them. Raphael's death in 1520 gave artistic fame a moment of public mourning. He died on Good Friday, according to tradition, at only 37, and was buried in the Pantheon, the ancient Roman building that had become the Church of Santa Maria ad Martyris. The burial mattered enormously. To place a painter in the Pantheon was to join Christian Rome, ancient Rome, and Renaissance artistic honor in one act of memory. Raphael's tomb inscription, later admired and repeated, suggested that nature herself had feared being surpassed by him and then feared dying with him. The praise was extravagant, but its extravagance reveals the new status artists could hold. Raphael's workshop continued after him, and that continuation reminds us that genius was never only the isolated hand. He had managed assistants, designs, and commissions on a scale that required organization as well as invention. Giulio Romano and others carried parts of his manner forward, adapting it to new patrons and changing tastes. A painter's style could now outlive him through pupils, drawings, prints, unfinished projects, and the desire of patrons to possess something associated with his name. Reputation became transmissible. The artist's manner could function almost like an inheritance. Michelangelo lived much longer, and the later part of his career unfolded under heavier spiritual and historical pressure. He returned to the Sistine Chapel to paint the Last Judgment behind the altar, a commission begun under Clement VII and completed under Paul III in the 1530s and early 1540s. The world around the work had changed since the ceiling. The Reformation had begun. Rome had been sacked in 1527, and Catholic reform was gathering force. The Last Judgment does not possess the same atmosphere as the ceiling. Its bodies turn, rise, fall, strain, and gather under a vision of final reckoning that feels less like confident creation and more like exposure before divine decision. The controversy over the Last Judgment's nudity shows how the climate had shifted. Some viewers admired its force, others found its bodily display troubling in so sacred a place. Later, parts of the fresco were altered to cover figures judged indecorous. The issue was not merely prudery. It reflected a changing relationship between art, devotion, reform, and institutional anxiety. The same anatomical power that had helped make Michelangelo supreme could appear dangerous when religious authorities worried that images might distract, confuse, or offend the faithful. Renaissance confidence in the body had not disappeared, but it was no longer received in quite the same way. Vittoria Colonna, the noble woman, poet, and spiritual friend of Michelangelo, belonged to this later world of inward religious seriousness. Their relationship was not simply courtly admiration. It joined poetry, reform-minded devotion, friendship, old age, and the artist's struggle with salvation and mortality. Michelangelo's late drawings and poems reveal a man increasingly concerned with the soul's dependence on grace, the limits of earthly beauty, and the insufficiency of fame before God. The public image of genius often hides this inward unease, but in Michelangelo it remained close to the surface. He had become famous beyond measure, and still fame could not settle the questions that mattered most to him. Giorgio Vasari then gave Renaissance artistic fame one of its most influential written forms. His lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects, first published in 1550 and expanded in 1568, arranged the history of Italian art as a progressive movement toward perfection, with Tuscan artists, and especially Michelangelo, occupying the highest place. Vasari was himself an artist, architect, court servant, and writer, and his book combined biography, anecdote, criticism, praise, local pride, and historical structure. It gave readers the lives of artists as stories worth knowing. The lives shaped memory so powerfully that later generations often inherited the Renaissance through Vasari's eyes. He preserved valuable information, but he also selected, arranged, praised, diminished, and dramatized. His Tuscan emphasis raised Florence and Michelangelo to exceptional height, while other regions and artists received different treatment. This does not make him useless. It makes him historical. Vasari shows how the Renaissance began writing its own genealogy, turning workshops, commissions, rivalries, failures, and temperaments into a story of ascent. The artist became not only a maker of images, but a subject of literature. This change had deep consequences. Earlier medieval builders, painters, and sculptors had often been admired, named, and remembered. But Renaissance Italy developed a stronger habit of attaching works to individual artistic lives. Patrons still mattered, workshops still mattered, materials and contracts still mattered, yet the named artist gained a new kind of historical presence. People wanted to know how Michelangelo behaved, how Raphael worked, how Leonardo thought, how Giotto had begun, how Brunelleschi solved problems, how Donatello shaped bronze and marble. Biography became one of the ways art acquired meaning. Print helped this transformation. Books could carry Vasari's judgments far beyond the cities where the works stood. Engravings and copies could spread compositions. Letters and reports could discuss artists as reputations moving across courts and countries. A person who had never seen the David, the Sistine ceiling, or the School of Athens could still know that these works mattered and that the men who made them belonged to the highest rank of human achievement. Fame no longer needed direct sight in the same way. It could travel through words. Yet the making of genius also required forgetting. It could forget assistants, apprentices, quarrymen, pigment grinders, plasterers, patrons, accountants, and the many people whose labor made great works possible. It could forget that an artist's freedom was often bound to another person's money. It could forget that unfinished works, failed techniques, political disruptions, and unpaid commissions were part of the same careers later made smooth by admiration. The warm glow around Renaissance genius is real in one sense, because extraordinary individuals did appear. It is incomplete in another, because those individuals stood within systems that gave their gifts form. Raphael's harmony and Michelangelo's force thus became two enduring faces of the High Renaissance. But neither face can hold the whole age. Behind them stood papal ambition, Florentine civic memory, workshop discipline, anatomical study, theological pressure, classical inheritance, and the machinery of reputation. Their greatness was personal, and it was historical. They made works that exceeded their circumstances. Yet those works cannot be understood without the circumstances that called them forth. The story now moves from artistic fame into political fracture. While Michelangelo and Raphael helped define what Renaissance genius could mean, Italy itself was becoming less able to protect the world that had produced them. Foreign armies, dynastic claims, papal maneuvers, mercenary captains, and fragile alliances were already changing the peninsula's balance, and the brilliance of its courts and cities would soon be seen against the harsher movement of war. Chapter 10: War, Diplomacy, and the Broken Italian Balance. Italian politics before 1494 depended on a balance that was never as stable as it looked from a distance. Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, and the papacy watched one another constantly, forming leagues, breaking agreements, hiring captains, arranging marriages, supporting exiles, and measuring danger through ambassadors' letters. Smaller courts such as Mantua, Ferrara, Urbino, and Rimini survived by skill, service, kinship, and caution. The peninsula was wealthy, urban, literate, and artistically brilliant, but it was divided among powers whose rivalries required endless management. Its culture had grown in the spaces created by that competition, and its vulnerability came from the same source. Condottieri gave this world one of its characteristic forms. These military captains served under contracts, leading companies of soldiers for cities, popes, kings, and princes who needed force but did not always maintain large permanent armies. Some condottieri became rulers themselves, as the Sforza had done in Milan. Their agreements set terms of service, payment, troop numbers, duration, and obligations, turning war into a negotiated profession as well as a danger. The system could be flexible and sophisticated, but it also depended on loyalty shaped by interest. When larger monarchies entered Italy with stronger resources, the old habits of managed conflict were tested severely. The immediate break came through Naples. Charles VIII of France inherited a claim to the kingdom through the Angevin line, and in 1494 he crossed the Alps with an army that included artillery capable of altering the rhythm of siege warfare. Ludovico Sforza of Milan, seeking advantage against rivals and anxious over the politics of Naples, had helped open the way. Italian rulers had long invited outside powers when it suited them, believing they could manage the consequences. Charles' descent showed how dangerous that habit had become. What began as one dynastic claim turned into a wider revelation of Italian weakness. The French army moved with a force that startled many observers. Cities negotiated, yielded, or watched carefully as Charles passed southward, and the speed of his progress exposed the fragility of alliances built for a different scale of war. Florence, already shaken by the expulsion of the Medici and the rise of Savonarola, had to receive the French king while trying to preserve its own unsettled republic. Rome faced him under Pope Alexander VI, whose own political calculations were complex and often mistrusted. Naples fell with remarkable ease in 1495, though the French hold on it soon weakened. The campaign did not create lasting French control, but it began the long Italian wars. One consequence of Charles's invasion was psychological. Italy had not been isolated from violence before, and its states had fought one another for generations. But foreign royal armies changed the feeling of political possibility. The peninsula's wealth made it attractive. Its divisions made it penetrable. France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire now saw Italian affairs as part of their own dynastic and strategic contests. Milan, Naples, Florence, Venice, and Rome became prizes, allies, obstacles, and bargaining pieces in a wider European game. Renaissance brilliance did not vanish, but it began to stand under heavier weather. Machiavelli entered public life in Florence after these shocks had begun. Born in 1469, he was old enough to remember the Medici regime and young enough to serve the republic that followed their expulsion. In 1498, the same year Savonarola died, Machiavelli became second chancellor and secretary to the Florentine Republic, a position that sent him into diplomatic contact with courts, camps, popes, kings, and captains. His work was practical before it was theoretical. He wrote dispatches, observed negotiations, carried instructions, interpreted motives, and watched power act under pressure. Diplomacy gave Machiavelli an education that no library alone could have provided. He met or studied figures who possessed force, cunning, luck, weakness, hesitation, and ambition in different proportions. He saw Florence's dependence on hired arms and became convinced that a republic needed its own militia if it wished to remain free. He watched larger powers treat smaller states with courtesy when useful and disregard when convenient. His later writings did not arise from abstract cynicism. They came from years spent seeing how fragile good intentions could be when unsupported by arms, money, discipline, and timing. Cesare Borgia offered Machiavelli one of his most important examples. The son of Pope Alexander VI, Caesar attempted to carve out a territorial state in central Italy with papal support, military skill, intimidation, negotiation, and administrative consolidation. He moved through the Romagna, bringing towns under control, removing rivals, and presenting himself as a ruler capable of imposing order where faction had long weakened government. Machiavelli observed him closely during diplomatic missions, and though he did not admire everything in a moral sense, he recognized qualities that mattered politically: decisiveness, adaptability, and the ability to use cruelty in measured service of authority. The most famous lesson came from Borgia's handling of the Romagna through his lieutenant Ramiro de Orco. Borgia used harsh administration to pacify disorder, then had Ramiro displayed publicly after execution, allowing the people to associate severity with the minister and justice with the prince. The details are grim, and the story should not be made theatrical. Its historical significance lies in the cold separation of political effect from personal sentiment. Machiavelli saw in Borgia a man who understood appearances, fear, gratitude, and blame as instruments of rule. Renaissance political thought had entered a world in which virtue could no longer be discussed only as moral excellence. Borgia's career also showed the role of fortune. His father's papacy gave him opportunity, armies, legitimacy, and resources. When Alexander VI died in 1503 and Caesar himself was ill, the foundation of his power weakened quickly. Julius II, the next strong pope, had no reason to preserve Borgia's project. The lesson for Machiavelli was double. Ability mattered, but timing and dependence mattered as well. A ruler could act boldly and still lose the conditions that made action possible. Power, like art, required materials beyond the individual will. Meanwhile, the Italian wars widened. France and Spain fought over Naples, and Spanish power eventually displaced the French there. Milan changed hands more than once, as French claims and Sforza restoration efforts collided with imperial and Swiss involvement. Venice expanded and then faced the League of Cambrai in 1508, when Pope Julius II, France, the Emperor, and others joined against it before alliances shifted again. The papacy itself fought as a territorial power, even while claiming spiritual authority. Italy had become a chessboard, but the pieces were living cities. taxed populations, hired soldiers, and courts whose cultural splendor depended on political survival. The Battle of Pavia in 1525 marked one of the decisive moments in the struggle between Francis I of France and Emperor Charles V. Francis, seeking to recover influence in Italy, was defeated and captured by imperial forces near Pavia. The result strengthened Habsburg power and weakened French hopes in northern Italy for a time. It also revealed the changing nature of warfare, where infantry, firearms, cavalry, fortification, and imperial finance belonged to a military world far larger than the older Italian balance. The Renaissance courts could commission poets and painters, but they could not always withstand the armies of dynastic Europe. Rome suffered the most symbolic rupture in 1527, when troops of Charles V, many of them unpaid and difficult to control, entered and sacked the city. Pope Clement VII, a Medici, took refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo while violence, looting, ransom, and humiliation spread through the city. The event shocked Europe because Rome was not merely another capital. It was the seat of the papacy, the city of apostles, ruins, pilgrims, artists, and recent magnificence. The same Rome that had gathered Bramante, Michelangelo, Raphael, and humanist grandeur now endured a collapse of protection that seemed to expose the vulnerability beneath its claims. The sack did not end Rome's artistic life, but it changed its atmosphere. Artists, scholars, and craftsmen scattered. Patrons lost money or confidence. Papal authority survived, but with a wound that no building could immediately cover. Later, Catholic reform and renewed artistic programs would reshape the city again, but the high Renaissance world of Julius II and Leo X had passed into a harsher memory. The meaning of magnificence altered when the city that displayed it could be occupied and stripped. Florence also moved through instability. The Medici returned, were expelled again, and returned once more under conditions shaped by larger powers. The republic that Machiavelli had served fell, and he lost office after the Medici Restoration in 1512. Imprisoned and tortured on suspicion of conspiracy, he was eventually released and withdrew to his small property at Sant'Andrea in Percasina. There, away from office but not from politics in his mind, he wrote The Prince, dedicating it to Lorenzo de' Medici in the hope of regaining favor. The book's later fame has made it seem like an isolated manifesto. It was also a job application from a man excluded from the political life he understood too well. The Prince compressed the lessons of Italian crisis into sharp reflections on rule, force, fortune, appearance, cruelty, generosity, fear, love, and the founding or preservation of states. Its coolness unsettled readers because it described political necessity without constantly covering it in moral consolation. Machiavelli did not invent ambition or deception, and he did not create the violence he analyzed. He named patterns that Italian politics had made visible. His thought belongs to the Renaissance, not because it is beautiful in the way a fresco is beautiful, but because it studies human action with the same unsparing attention that artists gave to bodies, faces, and space. His discourses on Livy reveal another side, rooted in republican admiration, civic conflict, law, arms, and ancient Roman example. Machiavelli did not only counsel princes, he cared deeply about republics and the conditions that allowed free states to endure. Ancient history served him not as ornament, but as a laboratory of political conduct. Here, the humanist recovery of Roman texts met the brutal experience of Italian weakness. Livy's Republic and Florence's failures spoke to one another across time. The Italian wars also affected artists directly. Leonardo's Milanese world had already been disrupted by French invasion. Michelangelo's commissions shifted with papal politics and Florentine crises. Raphael's Rome flourished under papal patronage that war and finance helped strain. Giulio Romano left Rome after Raphael's death and eventually worked in Mantua, where the Palazzo Te gave later Renaissance art a new theatrical freedom. Artistic styles moved with displaced artists, diplomatic gifts, prints, and changing patrons. War scattered culture even as it damaged the places that had gathered it. Venice managed the period with unusual resilience, though not without danger. Its maritime empire, mainland territories, patrician government, and commercial wealth gave it tools that differed from Florence or Milan. Venetian painting developed with color, atmosphere, and material richness in the works of Giovanni Bellini, Giorgione, Titian, and others, while the Republic navigated between European powers and Ottoman pressure. Venice reminds the story not to make Italian decline too simple. Some centers adapted, endured, and even flourished culturally while the political map shifted around them. Still, the old Italian balance had broken. The peninsula remained artistically fertile, intellectually active, and commercially important, but it no longer stood as the relatively self-contained political world in which the early Renaissance had grown. Spanish influence deepened in Naples and Milan. The papacy survived as a spiritual and territorial power under new pressures. Florence moved toward Medici ducal rule. The era of republics, courts, and city-states competing within Italian terms had been drawn into the heavier structure of European monarchy and empire. The brilliance of Renaissance Italy, therefore, has to be seen beside its fragility. Wealth funded art, but wealth attracted invasion. Division encouraged competition, but division invited intervention. Patronage produced masterpieces, but patronage depended on regimes that could fall. Humanist political language celebrated ancient liberty, while actual cities negotiated with kings, emperors, popes, captains, and creditors. This tension does not diminish the Renaissance. It gives the achievement its historical weight, because so much was made in a world that could not guarantee its own shelter. From Italy's broken balance, the story turns northward, where Renaissance art and learning took forms shaped by oil paint, print, urban devotion, reforming scholarship, royal courts, and religious fracture. The Renaissance did not remain Italian, and as it crossed the Alps, it entered colder light, different cities, different anxieties, and a Christian world beginning to divide more openly than before. Chapter 11. Northern Light, Humanism, and Religious Fracture. The Renaissance did not remain Italian, and it did not become European by turning every region into a copy of Florence or Rome. North of the Alps, the movement passed through different materials, different devotions, different cities, and different anxieties. The Low Countries, the German lands, France, England, and the courts of Burgundy and Habsburg Europe had their own traditions of painting, piety, scholarship, trade, and political life. Italy offered prestige, ancient example, mathematical space, and the powerful idea that art could remake the visible world. Northern Europe answered with oil paint, print, moral seriousness, minute observation, urban devotion, and eventually religious fracture. In the 15th century Low Countries, painting reached a different kind of intensity through the work of Jan van Eyck and those who followed him. Van Eyck did not invent oil painting in a simple way, though later memory sometimes gave him that honor. His achievement lay in refining the medium so that light, surface, fur, metal, glass, skin, jewels, tiles, and distant landscapes could be rendered with extraordinary care. Oil allowed slow layering and translucent glazes, and in skilled hands it made the world seem patiently examined rather than quickly described. A face could hold age and reserve, a robe could carry the weight of velvet, a window could open into a city whose tiny details still felt deliberate. The Arnolfini portrait, painted in 1434, shows the power of this northern attention. Giovanni Arnolfini and a woman long identified as his wife stand in a domestic interior filled with objects whose meanings have been debated for generations. The convex mirror, the dog, the shoes, the bed, the fruit, the candle, the joined hands, the artist's inscription. The painting is small compared with many Italian frescoes, but its interior seems dense with social, religious, and material meaning. It reveals a world in which household space, wealth, marriage, devotion, and self-presentation could be made visible through things. Northern painting often trusted objects to speak, and Van Eyck gave those objects a remarkable stillness. This was not the same visual path as Florentine perspective. Italian artists often organized space through geometry, architecture, and the measured relation between viewer and scene. Northern painters could be just as disciplined, but their discipline frequently moved through surface, reflection, texture, and accumulated detail. A polished mirror, a brass chandelier, a fur trimming, a rosary bead, or a distant town seen through a window might carry as much care as the human figure. The result was not lesser Renaissance, nor late Renaissance, nor provincial Renaissance. It was another way of enlarging attention. Burgundian and Netherlandish court culture helped sustain this art. The Dukes of Burgundy ruled a wealthy and complicated set of territories where ceremony, chivalric display, urban wealth, and dynastic ambition met. Artists such as Van Eyck served courts and patrons who wanted images of devotion, status, and memory. At the same time, prosperous towns such as Bruges, Ghent, Brussels, Antwerp, and later others gave merchants, guilds, and religious communities the means to commission panels, altarpieces, portraits, and devotional works. In the north, as in Italy, art grew from the meeting of faith, money, craft, and reputation. Albrecht Dürer carried this northern tradition into direct conversation with Italy. Born in Nuremberg in 1471, the son of a goldsmith, Dürer received training that joined precise handwork, drawing, and the practical intelligence of a major German city. Nuremberg was not Florence, but it was wealthy, literate, well-connected, and deeply involved in print. Dürer's early career unfolded in a world where images could travel as prints more easily than paintings, and this mattered enormously for his fame. A woodcut or engraving could carry his line across Europe, allowing his name and manner to become known in places where his paintings were never seen. His journeys to Italy, especially Venice, gave him contact with Italian art and with the prestige of proportion, theory, and classical form. Dürer did not leave Germany as an empty vessel waiting to be filled by Italy. He arrived with his own northern discipline, his own technical brilliance, and his own sense of image-making as both craft and intellect. In Venice, he encountered artists, merchants, German expatriates, and the self-confidence of a great maritime republic. His Feast of the Rose garlands, painted for the German community there, placed him within Venetian artistic life, while also asserting his own standing. He wanted Italian recognition, and he knew that recognition could alter what his career meant at home. Dürer's prints gave the Renaissance another kind of reach. The Apocalypse woodcut series, the engravings of night, death, and the devil, Melancholia I, and Saint Jerome in his study carried religious imagination, moral reflection, technical mastery, and intellectual symbolism into repeatable form. Prints could be collected, studied, copied, traded, and carried. They gave artists reputations beyond local patronage and allowed visual ideas to circulate with a speed that painting on panel rarely achieved. In Dürer, the northern line became both exact and inward, capable of describing hair, armor, light, tools, books, animals, and spiritual unease with equal seriousness. Humanism also took northern forms. Erasmus of Rotterdam, already encountered in the story of print, belonged to a network of scholars who wanted learning to reform Christian life rather than merely adorn courts. His Latin style, satire, editions, letters, and biblical scholarship made him one of the most famous intellectuals in Europe. Yet his position became increasingly difficult as religious conflict hardened around him. Erasmus wished for reform without rupture, learning without fanaticism, correction without violence, and piety without superstition. The age did not grant him such a simple path. His moderation, once admired by many, began to look evasive to those demanding clearer allegiance. Thomas More in England shared part of that humanist world. Born in 1478, trained in law, learned in Latin and Greek, and connected to Erasmus through friendship and correspondence, More joined scholarship to public service. His Utopia, published in 1516, imagined an island society through a layered and ambiguous literary form, mixing criticism of European greed, punishment, property, war, and pride with playful uncertainty about what should be believed. More's later life moved from humanist brilliance into the dangerous center of Tudor politics. Under Henry VIII, conscience, law, monarchy, and religious obedience would become matters not of elegant debate, but of survival. England's break with Rome did not begin as a purely doctrinal reformation in the same pattern as Luther's. Henry VIII had once defended Catholic teaching against Luther and received the title Defender of the Faith from the papacy. His desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his need for a male heir, his relationship with Anne Boleyn, and his assertion of royal supremacy all pulled England into a new religious settlement. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 made the king supreme head of the Church of England, and refusal to accept the new order carried severe consequences. More, who would not take the required oath in the form demanded, was executed in 1535. Holbein the Younger painted inside this charged world. Born in Augsburg and active in Basel before coming to England, Hans Holbein brought northern precision and courtly intelligence to the Tudor court. His portraits of Henry VIII, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Anne of Cleves, and others are not only likenesses, they are documents of rank, danger, fabric, flesh, and political performance. A sleeve, a chain, a ring, a fur collar, or a hand placed on a table can speak in Holbein's work with extraordinary restraint. He painted power without needing to make it loud. The sitter's stillness often carries the pressure of the court around them. Holbein's portrait of Henry VIII helped create one of the most enduring images of royal authority in Europe. The king stands broad, frontal, richly dressed, and immovable, his body turned into a political statement. It is easy to forget that such images were made within a world of anxiety. Failed marriages, succession fears, executions, religious change, diplomacy, and the redistribution of monastic wealth. Portraiture at court was never merely personal. It carried messages of legitimacy, fertility, alliance, magnificence, and command. Holbein's brilliance lay in making these messages appear through surfaces so controlled that they seem almost silent. Religious fracture changed the fate of images across Northern Europe. In some Protestant regions, statues, altarpieces, relics, and devotional paintings came under suspicion or attack because they were associated with idolatry, superstition, or clerical corruption. Iconoclasm varied by place and moment, and it should not be reduced to one crude impulse. For some reformers, the destruction or removal of images was a purification of worship. For others, it was disorder. For artists, patrons, and communities, it could mean the loss of familiar objects that had structured prayer, memory, and local identity for generations. The Reformation did not end art in Protestant Europe, but it altered what art could be asked to do. Portraits, prints, biblical illustrations, moral images, maps, books, domestic decoration, and civic works continued. In Lutheran areas, some religious images survived under different theological understandings. In Reformed areas, suspicion could be stronger. The market for art shifted as patrons changed. The sacred image no longer held the same position everywhere, and artists adapted to new conditions. Where one chapel wall had once carried a saint's life, a printed page, a portrait, or a household object might now carry visual attention. Peter Bruegel the Elder worked in the Low Countries in the middle of the 16th century, when religious tension, Habsburg rule, urban life, and rural memory all pressed upon one another. His paintings of peasants, seasons, children's games, proverbs, harvests, weddings, winter landscapes, and biblical scenes set among ordinary people gave northern art a wide human field. Bruegel did not paint peasants as simple ornaments for elite amusement alone. though elite viewers certainly owned his works. He observed gesture, labor, foolishness, festivity, fatigue, and the repetitive structures of communal life with an intelligence that resists easy condescension. The Hunters in the Snow, part of a cycle of seasons painted in 1565, shows winter not as a background, but as a whole condition. Hunters return with their dogs. The village lies below. Ponds hold skaters and small figures. Birds mark the pale air, and the landscape stretches into cold distance. The painting contains no single heroic center. Its force comes from the way human life continues inside weather, labor, hunger, play, and routine. This, too, belongs to the Renaissance expansion of attention. Not every great image had to glorify a prince, a saint, a philosopher, or a perfect body. A season could hold history. Bruegel's world was also touched by conflict. The Low Countries stood under Habsburg rule, and tensions over taxation, privilege, Protestant belief, and royal authority were moving toward revolt. His paintings do not function as simple political cartoons, yet many of them carry a sense of human folly under larger pressures. Proverbs multiply, blind men lead blind men, crowds gather, weddings unfold, children play with the seriousness of adults. Ordinary life becomes vast, not because it escapes history, but because it continues within it. Northern Renaissance culture therefore widened the story in several directions at once. It deepened the painted surface through oil and detail. It spread images through print. It joined scholarship to Christian reform. It turned portraits into instruments of courtly and political meaning. It forced artists to work amid changing religious rules. It made ordinary labor, household space, and seasonal life worthy of sustained attention. Italy remained central, but it no longer held the whole field. The Renaissance had become a European conversation, and like many conversations carried across borders, it changed tone as it moved. The final movement of the story now turns toward what came after the Renaissance, though no single door closed behind it. The habits formed in its cities, workshops, courts, presses, and studies passed into anatomy, astronomy, theater, natural philosophy, sacred painting, and literature. The age that had recovered ancient voices and trained the eye to measure the world was giving way to another world, still carrying Renaissance inheritance, but asking harder questions of the body, the heavens, authority, and the self. Chapter 12. After the Renaissance did not end at a single door. It did not close when Raphael died, or when Rome was sacked, or when Michelangelo's last figures darkened the Sistine wall, or when reform divided Western Christianity into camps that no council could easily reunite. Historical names often make the past easier to hold, but the life beneath those names rarely obeys them. The habits formed in Renaissance cities, workshops, courts, studies, and printing houses continued to move through Europe long after the age's most famous patrons and artists were gone. The attention to old texts, the trained eye, the dignity of the artist, the usefulness of mathematics, the hunger for reputation, and the desire to see nature directly all passed into another world. That later world was not simply brighter or wiser. It inherited confidence, but also conflict. The same century that admired proportion and eloquence saw religious wars, censorship, colonial violence, forced conversions, plunder, disease across oceans, and expanding empires. The Renaissance had enlarged the European imagination, and enlargement did not always mean gentleness. Maps improved, ships traveled farther, merchants calculated wider circuits of profit, and rulers learned to connect knowledge with conquest. A more curious Europe could also become a more dangerous Europe, because curiosity in the service of power rarely remains innocent. The body was one of the first places where Renaissance inheritance moved into a new form of knowledge. In 1543, Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, a large and richly illustrated work on human anatomy. Vesalius had studied at Paris and taught at Padua, and his work challenged errors that had long passed under the authority of Galen, whose ancient writings had shaped medical understanding for centuries. He did not reject antiquity because he despised it. He corrected ancient authority because direct observation had begun to demand its own rights. The lesson was deeply Renaissance, and already beyond it. Reverence for the old could lead, slowly and carefully, to disagreement with the old. Vesalius's book mattered as an object as well as an argument. Its woodcut illustrations presented the dissected body with a clarity and dignity that joined medical inquiry to artistic skill. Figures stood in landscapes, muscles displayed in ordered layers, bones arranged with almost sculptural care, and organs rendered as subjects of disciplined attention. The images were not casual additions to text. They carried knowledge through the eye, and the eye had been trained by more than a century of Renaissance art to expect structure, proportion, and legible form. Anatomy, printing, and visual culture met on the page. The heavens underwent a related disturbance. In the same year, 1543, Nicolaus Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, proposing a mathematical model in which Earth moved around the Sun rather than resting immobile at the center of the cosmos. The book did not instantly overturn ordinary belief, and its arguments were technical enough that many readers encountered them through specialists rather than common conversation. Yet the proposal changed the scale of intellectual uncertainty. The world beneath human feet remained solid in daily experience, but the learned structure that explained its place in the heavens had begun to shift. Copernicus belonged to the world of humanist learning, church office, mathematics, astronomy, and manuscript circulation before print carried his work more widely. His model relied on ancient sources as well as new calculation, and in that sense it did not break crudely with the past. It rearranged inheritance. Like so many Renaissance transformations, it returned to older authorities and then used them in a way that unsettled later habit. The sun-centered cosmos did not immediately become accepted truth, but it made certain questions impossible to return to their former stillness. Galileo Galilei carried observation further in the early 17th century. Born in Pisa in 1564, the same year Michelangelo died, he inherited a world in which mathematics, instruments, courtly patronage, print, and reputation all mattered. When he turned a telescope toward the heavens in 1609 and 1610, he saw mountains and shadows on the moon, many more stars than unaided sight had counted, and 4 moons circling Jupiter. These observations did not merely add curiosities to astronomy, they troubled assumptions about heavenly perfection, celestial simplicity, and Earth's privileged position. Galileo's Sidereus Nuncius, published in 1610, shows how Renaissance and post-Renaissance habits joined. Observation needed an instrument, discovery needed mathematical interpretation, fame needed print, security needed a patron. Galileo named the moons of Jupiter the Medicean stars in honor of the Medici, binding celestial observation to courtly advancement. A telescope looked outward, but the book that described its findings moved through the familiar channels of dedication, reputation, rivalry, and institutional judgment. Even when knowledge seemed to rise above politics, it still needed a world to receive it. This is one of the quieter continuities after the Renaissance. The new sciences did not appear in a clean space where patrons, printers, universities, courts, and churches had vanished. They appeared inside those structures, sometimes using them, sometimes resisting them, often depending on them. A scholar required books, instruments, correspondence, money, students, permission, protection, and readers. The Republic of Letters widened, but it remained a social world. Knowledge still moved through human hands. Painting also changed after the High Renaissance, without leaving it entirely. Caravaggio, born in 1571, brought sacred painting into a more immediate and bodily register. In Rome, his works for churches and patrons used ordinary models, strong contrasts of light and dark, close human presence, and an almost uncomfortable nearness to physical life. Saints, apostles, musicians, card sharps, martyrs, and calling scenes entered his canvases with worn feet, tense hands, lowered faces, and bodies that seemed taken from the streets rather than ideal invention. This was not the calm harmony of Raphael, nor the heroic strain of Michelangelo. It was another way of making the sacred visible. Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew in San Luigi dei Francesi shows this change with remarkable concentration. The scene unfolds around a table, with men dressed in clothing close to Caravaggio's own age, while Christ's gesture enters from the side with an authority at once understated and decisive. The painting does not depend on distant grandeur. It brings conversion into a room of money, attention, hesitation, and recognition. In that sense, Caravaggio inherited the Renaissance concern with the human body and the visible moment, but turned it towards sharper immediacy. The divine did not require polished distance. It could arrive among ordinary faces. His life was unstable, marked by quarrels, flight, legal trouble, and violence, and the private details should not be made into a spectacle. What matters for the larger story is that his art helped open the Baroque, an age in which movement, emotion, theatrical light, and religious urgency took forms different from the measured structures of earlier Renaissance painting. After the Council of Trent, Catholic art had new pastoral and doctrinal pressures. Images were expected to be clear, moving, and suitable to devotion. Caravaggio's power came partly from meeting that need in a language of startling nearness. Literature, too, carried Renaissance inheritance into a more unsettled modernity. In England, William Shakespeare wrote for a public theatre culture shaped by London's growth, print, patronage, classical education, popular entertainment, and the politics of monarchy. The Globe and other theatres did not resemble Italian courts, yet they depended on many Renaissance conditions: grammar school training in Latin, knowledge of Roman history, rhetorical skill, printed chronicles, translations, and an audience increasingly used to complex speech. Shakespeare's plays filled the stage with kings, soldiers, lovers, fools, ghosts, citizens, daughters, merchants, conspirators, and inwardly divided minds. Theatre made human complexity audible. Hamlet's delay, Lear's ruin, Macbeth's ambition, Portia's wit, Falstaff's appetite, Cleopatra's theatrical sovereignty, and Prospero's art all belong to a world where language could turn thought over in public. Shakespeare did not write philosophy in the formal manner of a scholastic or humanist treatise, but his plays carried the Renaissance expansion of attention into action, speech, memory, and self-questioning. The human being became difficult to summarize, and that difficulty itself became dramatic. Miguel de Cervantes, in Spain, gave another inheritance its modern turn. Don Quixote, published in two parts in 1605 and 1615, looked back toward chivalric romance and forward toward the novel's unstable play with illusion, reading, dignity, madness, comedy, and disappointment. Cervantes had lived through war, captivity, financial trouble, and the layered world of imperial Spain, and his fiction carries a wisdom sharpened by experience without becoming bitter in a simple way. Don Quixote reads old books so intensely that he tries to inhabit them, and the world answers him with inns, roads, villagers, servants, jokes, cruelty, tenderness, and misunderstanding. In Cervantes, the Renaissance love of books becomes both moving and dangerous. Reading enlarges the soul, but it can also distort the world when desire overwhelms judgment. This was a fitting afterimage for an age that had recovered antiquity, multiplied texts, and built identities from inherited forms. Europe had learned to live among books with new intensity. Cervantes asked what might happen when books became not only guides but worlds that competed with the one beneath a person's feet. The political world had changed as well. Italian city-states no longer held the same central position they had occupied in the 15th century. Spain, France, England, the Habsburg monarchy, the Ottoman Empire, the Dutch Republic, and other powers shaped a wider, more militarized, more oceanic Europe. The Mediterranean remained important, but the Atlantic world had become unavoidable. The voyages of Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan's expedition, and many others had drawn European ambition into contact with lands, peoples, empires, and ecosystems that Europeans did not understand and often harmed severely. Renaissance curiosity and violence traveled together. The recovery of ancient geography, the improvement of maps, the mathematics of navigation, and the appetite for trade all belonged to this expansion. So did conquest, slavery, extraction, missionary pressure, and epidemic catastrophe among indigenous peoples. A sleep history chronicle need not dwell on the harshest details to acknowledge the scale of consequence. The Renaissance was never only the story of paintings and books inside Europe. It was also part of the formation of a world in which European knowledge and European power began to move with far greater reach. Francis Bacon, writing in the early 17th century, gave voice to another inheritance, the call for organized inquiry into nature. His emphasis on experiment, collection, method, and useful knowledge did not emerge from nothing. It followed centuries in which humanists had corrected texts, artists had studied bodies and light, engineers had solved practical problems, and printers had created communities of shared reference. Bacon's program belonged to a later age, but it carried Renaissance confidence that human beings could improve their understanding by disciplined attention. The object of attention had shifted more strongly from ancient words to nature's processes. Still, the Renaissance left no single legacy. It left techniques, institutions, ambitions, anxieties, and myths. It left the artist as a figure of fame. It left the scholar as a recoverer and corrector of texts. It left the courtier as a crafted social being. It left the ruler surrounded by images of legitimacy. It left the printer's shop as a machine of memory and conflict. It left the body measured, the city pictured, the page multiplied, the heavens questioned, and the self made more visible in words. Many of its works survived by accident as much as intention. Frescoes endured damp, smoke, war, restoration, neglect, and devotion. Books crossed centuries because someone shelved them, copied them, bought them, rebound them, or forgot them in a safe enough place. Marble statues lost noses, arms, settings, and original meanings, yet remained able to gather new admiration. Buildings changed function, chapels changed patrons, paintings moved from altars to collections, and manuscripts entered libraries whose founders could not have known every future reader. Survival itself became part of the history. A page from an Aldine edition, a worn stone stair in a palace, a drawing in brown ink, a letter folded and sealed, a fresco surface repaired many times, a bronze door touched by generations of weather and regard. These things carry the Renaissance more quietly than the word Renaissance does. They do not announce a golden age. They remain. Their edges show use. Their colors have altered. Their meanings have been argued over, and still they hold traces of the people who made, paid for, studied, prayed before, corrected, copied, praised, feared, and remembered them. In Florence, the dome still rises over the city that once debated its possibility. In Rome, the Sistine ceiling remains above the chapel where ceremonies continued long after Julius II and Michelangelo were gone. In Venice, printed books from old presses rest in libraries far from the workshops that made them. In the Low Countries, painted interiors still hold mirrors, beads, fur, candles, fruit, hands, and windows with patient care. Across Europe, the Renaissance is less a closed age than a layer beneath later ones, sometimes visible, sometimes covered, but rarely absent. The story that began in late medieval Italian cities therefore settles not in an ending, but in continuance. Merchant ledgers, humanist letters, courtly portraits, papal walls, printed pages, anatomical plates, telescopic notes, theatre speeches, and old stones all belong to the same long passage of attention. Some were made for God, some for princes, some for profit, some for fame, some for inquiry, and some for reasons that have thinned with time. Together they show an age trying to look more carefully at what had been inherited, what could be made, what could be known, and what might still be remembered. And after all the names have softened, Dante, Petrarch, Cosimo, Brunelleschi, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Erasmus, Luther, Dürer, Vesalius, Galileo, Caravaggio, Shakespeare, Cervantes, the remaining things are quieter than their reputations. Paper rests in bindings, pigment holds to plaster, stone keeps the warmth of daylight and the coolness of evening. A line drawn by a long dead hand remains where the hand left it, thin, deliberate, and still. The journey is complete. Rest well.